I drove to Maple Grove believing turning 30 meant a fresh start, but the silence in my parents' kitchen hit harder than the smell of stale oil. 73 people stood like statues, watching me clutch a bottle of wine. No balloons, no candles, just a knife laid out with surgical precision. My father didn't wish me a happy birthday. He simply pointed to a thick manila folder and told me we needed to discuss the return on their investment. My name is Sophia Barnes, and until 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in late October, I lived under the impression that I had finally paid my dues. I had spent the last decade tirelessly climbing the corporate ladder at North Glass Strategy Group, effectively trading my 20s for a corner office and a salary that finally allowed me to breathe without checking my bank balance every morning. I had just closed the Anderson account, a merger that had been dragging on for 18 months, and for the first time in my life, the future did not look like an uphill battle against gravity. It looked bright. It looked manageable. Driving north on I-94 toward Maple Grove, Minnesota, I allowed myself a rare moment of self-congratulation. I was turning 30 today. In the grand, terrifying scheme of adulthood, 30 felt like the crossing of a threshold. It was the age where you were supposed to stop apologizing for existing and start actually living. I had imagined this night for weeks. I pictured a quiet dinner with my parents, Graham and Elaine. I pictured my mother's signature pot roast, perhaps a glass of the expensive Cabernet I had bought on my way out of the city, and a conversation that did not revolve around my career trajectory or my lack of a husband. I wanted, just for one night, to be their daughter, not their investment project. The Minnesota autumn was in full swing, the trees stripping themselves bare against a steel gray sky, and the air held that crisp, biting promise of impending snow. I turned into the subdivision where I had grown up, a labyrinth of beige siding and manicured lawns that always felt aggressively peaceful. It was the kind of neighborhood where people power washed their driveways and noticed if you brought your trash bins in 20 minutes late. As I rounded the corner onto Birchwood Lane, the peaceful image shattered. My parents' driveway was full. It was not just full, it was overflowing. Cars were jammed bumper to bumper, spilling out onto the street, lining the curb on both sides for 3 houses down. My heart hammered against my ribs. A sudden, violent rhythm, panic, cold and sharp, flooded my chest. My first thought was not a party. My first thought was a catastrophe. I slammed the car into park behind a silver sedan I did not recognize and killed the engine. My hands were shaking as I unbuckled my seatbelt. Had Dad had a heart attack? Had Mom fallen? Why were there so many cars? It looked like a funeral wake, or the staging ground for a crisis intervention. I grabbed the bottle of Cabernet from the passenger seat, not because I thought I would drink it, but because my hands needed something to grip, something to anchor me to reality. I ran up the driveway, bypassing the front door. We never used the front door. The front door was for strangers and census takers. Family came in through the garage. I punched the 4-digit code into the keypad. 1996, the year we moved in, and the heavy door groaned upward on its tracks. The smell hit me instantly, and for a split second, I almost cried with relief. It was the smell of my childhood, a specific, unchangeable blend of motor oil, damp concrete, and the musty scent of old cardboard boxes stacked in the rafters. It was the smell of safety. It was the smell of Dad tinkering with his lawnmower on Saturday mornings. It was the smell of Mom storing away winter coats in plastic bins. I stepped inside, the automatic light flickering on with a low hum. There were shoes everywhere, dozens of pairs lined up on the mat by the interior door. A chaotic sea of leather loafers, sensible heels, and winter boots. I recognized my Aunt Linda's purple sneakers. I saw the scuffed work boots belonging to our neighbor, Mr. Henderson. I took a deep breath, trying to slow my racing heart. It was a surprise party. That had to be it. I felt a flush of embarrassment for my earlier panic. They had invited the extended family, the neighbors, maybe even some of my old school friends. I looked down at my clothes. A sharp charcoal blazer and dark jeans. and wished I had worn something softer, something less like armor, but it did not matter. They had done this for me. My parents, who were usually so reserved, so practical, had actually organized a surprise party for my 30th. I arranged a smile on my face, the kind of surprised, grateful expression I knew was expected of me. I shifted the wine bottle to my left hand, reached for the doorknob, and pushed the door open, ready to shout surprise before they could, but the word died in my throat. There was no shout. There was no collective cheer. There was no sudden burst of noise or laughter. I stepped into the kitchen, and the silence was so absolute it felt physical, like walking into a wall of water. The kitchen, usually a spacious open-concept area that fed into the living room, was packed. I did rapid mental math, a reflex from my job. There were at least 70 people here, maybe more, my aunts, my uncles, cousins I had not seen since Christmas 3 years ago, neighbors I had waved to but never spoken to, and people I did not recognize at all. They were standing shoulder to shoulder, filling every available square foot of the hardwood floor, and they were all staring at me. It was not the warm, welcoming gaze of a birthday celebration. It was the heavy, flat stare of a congregation waiting for a sermon, or a jury waiting for the defendant to take the stand. No one moved, no one raised a glass, no one smiled. The air in the room was hot and stifling, smelling faintly of potpourri and nervous sweat. "Mom? Dad?" My voice sounded thin, scratching against the silence. The crowd parted slightly, creating a narrow corridor toward the fireplace. That was where they were standing. My mother, Elaine, was near the kitchen island. She was wearing her good navy dress, the one she wore to weddings and funerals. Her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She was looking at a spot on the floor about 3 feet to my left. She refused to lift her eyes. Her posture was rigid, her jaw set so hard I could see the muscles working beneath her skin. My father, Graham, stood by the fireplace. He looked taller than I remembered, or maybe the room just felt smaller. He was wearing a suit, which was bizarre for a Tuesday night at home. In his hands, he held a thick beige manila folder. It was bulging with papers, the corners slightly dog-eared. He held it with both hands, like a shield, or perhaps a weapon. I took a step forward, the floorboard creaking loudly under my boot. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "I thought something was wrong," I stammered, holding up the wine bottle slightly, a pathetic offering to the room. "I saw all the cars. I thought there was an emergency." I looked around, desperate to make eye contact with someone, anyone who would give me a cue. I looked at Aunt Linda. She turned her head away. I looked at Mr. Henderson. He studied his shoes. The atmosphere was suffocating. It felt like I had walked in on something private, something shameful, and yet they were all looking at me as if I were the cause of it. "Happy birthday?" I tried, but it came out as a question. My father did not smile. He did not move from his spot by the fireplace. He looked at me with a cold, detached expression I had seen him use when negotiating with contractors or disputing a bill over the phone. It was a look devoid of affection. "We are not here to celebrate, Sophia," Graham said. His voice was steady, practiced. It did not sound like my father. It sounded like a man delivering a foreclosure notice. "Graham," my mother whispered, a sharp, warning sound, but she still did not look at me. "We need to talk," Graham continued, ignoring her. He tapped the folder in his hands. "We need to talk about what we have spent on you." I blinked, my brain struggling to process the sentence. "What?" "The cost," he said, his voice rising just enough to carry to the back of the room. "The investment. We have been running the numbers. Sophia, for 30 years. I looked at the kitchen island behind my mother. There was a cake there, a large white sheet cake from the local bakery, but there were no candles on it. There was no frosting writing out my name. Instead, there was a long, serrated knife and a stack of silver forks, laid out in a perfect military-grade row. It looked less like a dessert and more like surgical instruments prepared for an operation. My stomach turned over. This was not a party. This was an intervention. But for what? I did not do drugs. I did not have a gambling problem. I had a job that paid 6 figures. I had a credit score of 780. I was the model child. I was the success story they bragged about in their Christmas letters. I don't understand, I said, my voice trembling. Dad, what is going on? Who are all these people? Witnesses, he said simply. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the Minnesota winter. Witnesses. You only needed witnesses for a crime or a contract. My eyes darted around the room again, frantic now, trying to find an escape route. That was when I saw her, in the far corner of the living room, near the bay window. There was a wingback chair. It was my mother's favorite chair, the one with the expensive upholstery that no one was allowed to sit in. Even during holidays, that chair remained empty, a silent testament to Elaine's obsession with order. But tonight, someone was sitting in it. A woman I had never seen before was perched on the edge of the cushion. She was striking, with sharp, angular features and silver hair cut in a precise bob. She was wearing a camel-colored wool coat that looked like it cost more than my car. She sat with her legs crossed, a leather briefcase resting against her ankle. She was not looking at the floor like my relatives. She was not looking at Graham like the neighbors. She was looking directly at me. Her gaze was intense, analytical. She swept her eyes over me from head to toe, taking in my boots, my jeans, my blazer, my terrified expression. It was the look of an appraiser examining a piece of real estate, checking the foundation for cracks, deciding if the structure was worth the asking price. She did not blink. She did not smile. She just watched, her hands resting calmly on her lap. Sophia, my father said, drawing my attention back to him. He opened the folder. The sound of the stiff paper crinkling was deafening in the silent room. We have calculated everything, every doctor's visit, every piano lesson you hated, the braces, the college tuition, the car insurance, the food, the electricity. He pulled out a sheet of paper. It was a spreadsheet, even from 10 feet away. I could see the rows and columns, the dense black ink of data. We have been very generous, he said, his tone chillingly conversational. But every investment has a maturity date, and today is yours. He looked at the crowd, then back at me. We are done, Sophia. The room seemed to tilt. The smell of the motor oil from the garage seemed to cling to my clothes, heavy and suffocating. I looked at the woman in the camel coat again. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing, as if the show was finally getting to the interesting part. I stood frozen in the kitchen of the house where I had learned to walk, clutching a bottle of wine that was suddenly heavy as lead, realizing with a dawn of horror that the people surrounding me were not guests. They were a jury, and the verdict had already been decided before I even walked through the door. My hand reached out and took the folder. It was a mechanical action, a reflex born of a decade in corporate boardrooms where someone hands you a document and you take it, regardless of whether you want to read what is inside. The manila cover felt rough against my sweating palms. The weight of it was substantial, heavy with the density of 30 years of paper. I looked down. The first page was not a greeting. It was not a letter. It was a spreadsheet. The font was Times New Roman, size 12. Perfectly formatted with bold headers and alternating gray and white rows for readability. The title at the top was centered and underlined. S. Barnes, Cost Log, 1996 to present. My breath hitched in my throat, a small, strangled sound that seemed too loud in the silent room. I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like an audit. It looked like the financial breakdown of a failing subsidiary that was about to be liquidated. I read the first line. October 14th, 1996. Formula and diapers, $82.50. I read the second line. November 2nd, 1996. Pediatrician visit. Ear infection copay, $25. Note: crying disrupted sleep schedule for 3 nights. My eyes skipped down the page, my brain struggling to comprehend the sheer pettiness of the data. It was all there, every single cent. August 2002. Piano lessons. Mrs. Gable. $40 per session. Note: Sophia showed lack of aptitude after 4 months. Wasted expenditure. July 2004. Emergency room. Broken arm. $500 deductible. Note: Result of climbing tree despite explicit prohibition. Avoidable expense. March 2011. Orthodontics. $5,200. Note: Cosmetic necessity for future employability. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. This was not just a list of expenses, it was a diary of resentment. Every line item had a date, a dollar amount, and a comment that stripped the event of any emotional warmth. They had not just paid for these things, they had cataloged them as burdens. They had written down the cost of my pain, the price of my smile, the financial impact of my existence. My eyes blurred as I flipped the page. There were pages and pages of it. Summer camps I thought they had sent me to because they wanted me to have fun were listed under childcare logistics during work hours. My prom dress, a blue chiffon number I had loved, was listed as social integration fee. Even the checks, the $50 checks my grandmother sent me for Christmas, which I thought were gifts, were recorded here as income offset, subtracted from the running total of my debt to them. I looked at the bottom of the final page. There was a thick black line, and below it, a number in bold, $642,918.43. Below that number was a single sentence, justified to the center. Return of investment discussion required. I looked up, my vision swimming. My father was watching me. He did not look angry. He looked vindicated. He looked like a man who had finally balanced a ledger that had been annoying him for 3 decades. "We kept track," Graham said. His voice was calm, reasonable, terrifying. "Because we knew, eventually, we would need to show you the reality of the situation. We wanted to be precise." "Precise?" I whispered. "Dad, you logged my diapers. You logged my broken arm." "We logged the costs incurred by a liability," he corrected me. Before I could process the cruelty of that word, there was a movement to my left. My mother, Elaine, had stepped away from the kitchen island. She was carrying something. It was a bag. I recognized it instantly. It was my old navy blue duffel bag from high school, the one with the cracked leather strap and the faded logo of the debate team on the side. It was lumpy and zipped shut. She walked over to the door leading to the garage, the door I had just walked through, and set the bag down on the floor with a heavy thud. It was the only luggage in the room. "Graham," Elaine said, her voice flat. "Get to the point," Graham nodded. He reached out and flipped the page of the folder I was still holding. I looked down at the new document. It was different from the spreadsheet. It was on glossy paper, bearing the logo of a private genetic testing laboratory I recognized from billboards downtown. It was a paternity and maternity analysis. The colorful bar graphs that usually showed percentages of heritage or health risks were replaced by a stark, simple table. Subject: Sophia Barnes. Alleged father: Graham Barnes. Alleged mother: Elaine Barnes. I stared at the numbers in the right-hand column. Probability of paternity: 0.00%. Probability of maternity: 0.00%. Conclusion: no biological relationship detected. The world stopped. The hum of the refrigerator, the sound of breathing, the beating of my own heart. It all vanished into a vacuum of white noise. I stared at the zeros. They were perfect circles, empty and absolute. "We have been very generous," Graham said, his voice coming from a great distance. "We raised you, we fed you, we educated you, we invested over $600,000 in you, but the fact remains, Sophia, you do not belong to us." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. "And now that you are 30, now that the legal obligations are fully discharged, we are closing the account." I stood there, paralyzed. My mind raced backward, scanning 30 years of memories for a clue, a hint, a cracked foundation, I looked for the moment I should have known. Was it the way Elaine never wanted to hold my hand in public? Was it the way Graham never called me sweetheart, only Sophia? Was it the way they never put my drawings on the fridge? Preferring the pristine white surface? I thought they were just strict. I thought they were just private people. I did not know they were waiting. They had been waiting for 30 years. A sound broke the silence. It was a slow, rhythmic clapping. Clap, clap, clap. It was not loud. It was polite. It sounded like the applause at the end of a budget meeting or a Rotary Club presentation. I looked up, dazed. A man in a gray suit near the window was clapping. Then my Aunt Linda joined in. Then a few neighbors. It was not a thunderous ovation. It was scattered, awkward, obligatory. They were applauding the presentation. They were applauding Graham for finally presenting the bill. They were acknowledging that the transaction was complete. The sound was more violent than a slap across the face. It stripped me of my humanity. To them. I was not a daughter finding out she was adopted. I was a failed project that had finally been written off. I looked at the crowd. 73 people. They knew. They all knew. That was why they were here. They had not come to sing happy birthday. They had come to watch the eviction. They were the witnesses to the termination of a contract. My eyes found the woman in the camel coat again. She was the only one not clapping. She was staring at the DNA results in my hand, her expression unreadable, her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked like she wanted to say something, but she remained silent, observing the brutality with a professional detachment. I did not scream. I did not throw the wine bottle. I did not fall to my knees and beg. My reaction was something far more dangerous. I went cold. I looked at the spreadsheet again. The date on the first entry was October 14th, 1996. I was born on October 12th. They had started this log 2 days after bringing me home. Most parents keep baby books. They keep locks of hair and first teeth. My parents kept receipts. They had known from the very beginning that I was not theirs, or at least that they did not want me. And instead of giving me up, instead of letting me go to a family that might have loved me, they kept me. They kept me like you keep a rental car, checking the mileage, worrying about the depreciation, waiting for the day you can return the keys. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was not the rejection that shattered me. It was the duration of the lie. They had faked it. For 3 decades. Every morning, every night, every holiday. They had faked being a family while secretly tallying the cost. I looked at Elaine. She was standing by the door, next to my old duffel bag. Her face was composed. She smoothed the front of her dress, checking for invisible wrinkles. "Why?" I asked. My voice was raspy, dry as dust. "Why wait 30 years? Why not tell me when I was 18? Why not tell me when I graduated college?" Elaine looked at me, and her eyes were empty. There was no pity in them. There was only the mild annoyance of someone who wanted to get back to their evening routine. "The terms required 30 years, she said cryptically. She gestured to the bag. "I packed the essentials. Your winter coat is in there, some toiletries, the rest of your things, the furniture, the books, the electronics. Those were purchased with our funds. They stay here to recoup some of the loss." She took a step closer to me, lowering her voice so the neighbors wouldn't hear, maintaining the facade of propriety even as she destroyed my life. "I folded your clothes," she said, as if that absolved her of everything. "I made sure they are neat, so take the bag. Sophia, take the folder, and go. Don't make a scene. It is unbecoming." Don't make a scene. That was the command that had ruled my life. Don't cry when you scrape your knee. Don't laugh too loud at the dinner table. Don't ask why we don't hug. Don't make a scene. I looked at the folder in my hand. 0%. $642,000. I looked at the cake with the knife but no candles. I looked at the 73 faces watching me, waiting for me to leave so they could probably eat that cake and talk about how generous the Barnes family had been to harbor a stray for so long. I felt a shifting inside me. The part of me that was Sophia Barnes. the dutiful daughter, the successful strategist, the girl who wanted to please, began to dissolve. In its place, something harder was forming, something cold and sharp, forged in the realization that my entire identity was a line item in a ledger. I closed the folder. I did not give it back to Graham. I tucked it under my arm, pressing it against my ribs. It was mine now. It was the only inheritance I was ever going to get. I walked over to the door. I did not look at my father. I did not look at the crowd. I stopped in front of Elaine. She flinched, just slightly, as if she expected me to hit her. "You folded my clothes," I repeated, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor that had been there a minute ago. "Yes," she said, lifting her chin defiantly. "Thank you," I said. The sarcasm was so faint, it was almost invisible, but I saw it land. I saw the confusion flicker in her eyes. She expected tears. She expected yelling. She did not expect a thank you. I bent down and picked up the duffel bag. It was lighter than I expected. 30 years of life, compressed into 20 pounds of fabric. I turned my back on them. I did not say goodbye. You do not say goodbye to a bank teller when you close an account. You just walk away. As I reached for the door handle, I heard the woman in the camel coat stand up. The sound of her chair scraping against the floor was loud in the silence. "Wait," she said. Her voice was clear, authoritative, and it cut through the room like a blade. I froze, my hand on the cold metal of the doorknob. "Mr. Barnes," the woman said, and I could hear her heels clicking on the hardwood as she walked toward the center of the room. "You have presented your ledger. You have presented your DNA evidence. You have made your statement." She paused. "But you have forgotten one thing," Graham huffed. An impatient sound. "And who are you?" "I didn't invite you." "No," she said. "You didn't, but you invited the truth." I turned around slowly. The woman was standing in the middle of the kitchen now, facing my parents. She was not looking at me anymore. She was looking at them with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You calculated the cost of raising her," the woman said, pointing a manicured finger at the folder under my arm. "But you failed to calculate the cost of what you just did tonight." She turned her head and looked me in the eye. "Don't leave yet, Sophia." My name sounded different when she said it. It didn't sound like a liability. It sounded like a question that was about to be answered. Graham stepped forward, his face reddening. "This is a private family matter. I want her out of my house, now." "It ceased to be a private matter when you gathered an audience," the woman replied coolly. She reached into her heavy wool coat and pulled out a sleek, black leather wallet. She flipped it open. A silver badge glinted under the kitchen lights, though I couldn't make out the inscription from where I stood. "And it ceased to be a family matter," she continued. "The moment you admitted to fraud." The word hung in the air. Fraud. Elaine gasped. Graham's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about," Graham spat. "I think you do," the woman said. "You just handed that girl a document proving you accepted money, tax credits, deductions, perhaps even stipends, for a child you knew wasn't yours, for 30 years. She smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a shark smile. "That six-figure sum you are so proud of? The IRS calls that evidence." The room erupted into whispers. The statue-like stillness of the 73 witnesses broke. They shifted, murmured, exchanged nervous glances. The show had gone off script. I stood by the door, the bag in my hand, the folder under my arm, and for the first time that night, I didn't feel like the victim. I felt like the witness. And the trial was just beginning. The silence that followed the stranger's interruption was brittle, like a pane of glass vibrating right before it shatters. The woman in the camel coat, who had just effectively accused my father of fraud in front of the entire neighborhood, did not retreat. She stepped fully into the light of the kitchen chandelier, her presence commanding more gravity than the 70-odd people squeezed into the room combined. "Who are you?" Graham demanded again, his voice rising an octave. He tried to puff out his chest, to regain the dominance he had held only moments ago with his spreadsheet and his cruel revelations. But the dynamic had shifted. The air in the room no longer smelled like his victory, it smelled like danger. The woman smoothed the lapel of her coat. "My name is Marianne Holt," she said, her voice projecting clearly to the back of the room where the neighbors were craning their necks. "I am the senior legal representative for the Langford Family Trust." The name landed in the room with a heavy, confusing thud. Langford. It was not a name I knew. It was not a name that appeared on any Christmas card lists or family tree diagrams I had ever seen. My parents exchanged a look, a quick, sharp flicker of eyes that betrayed not confusion, but a sudden, terrified recognition. Marianne continued, her gaze locked on mine. "In 1996, at Brightvale Medical Center, there was a procedural error in the neonatal unit, a significant error involving patient identification bracelets." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "The Langford family has been conducting a private inquiry for 18 months. We have been tracing a specific genetic marker, and that trail led us here, to you, Sophia." My grip on the duffel bag tightened until my knuckles turned white. A hospital error. Switched at birth. It was the stuff of daytime soap operas and bad paperbacks, not something that happened in a beige subdivision in Minnesota. And yet, the DNA result in the folder under my arm suddenly made a horrifying kind of sense. It wasn't that my parents had simply adopted me and grown to regret it. It was that I was a mistake from the very first breath. "That is irrelevant," Graham shouted, stepping between me and Marianne, effectively cutting off my line of sight. He waved his hand dismissively, a gesture I had seen him use 1,000 times to end arguments he was losing. "I don't care about your hospital errors. I don't care about some trust fund. This is my house. This is my daughter, or rather, the woman who used to be my daughter. And I am telling you, she is leaving, right now. She has 1 hour to vacate the premises before I call the police for trespassing." He turned his glare on me, his face twisting into a sneer. "You heard me? Get out." Marianne did not flinch. She did not even blink. She simply took a step to the side, bypassing Graham's physical blockade as if he were a piece of furniture. "Actually, Mr. Barnes, it is extremely relevant," Marianne said, her tone dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. "Because 5 minutes ago, you stood in front of this room and admitted to keeping a detailed financial log of a child you claim is not yours. You admitted to a transactional relationship with a minor." She glanced at the neighbors, then back at Graham. "You just handed Sophia a document that could be interpreted as evidence of extortion. You essentially admitted that you viewed her upbringing as a business deal waiting to be cashed out. And now that the Langford family has found her, and now that we know exactly how you have treated her, I would suggest you be very, very careful about your next sentence." Graham opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His face went from red to a pale, blotchy gray. He looked at the folder under my arm, the folder he had so proudly presented, and realized, perhaps for the first time, that he had handed me a weapon. I stood there, feeling the floor tilting under my feet. The narrative was spinning out of control. My parents wanted this to be a shaming. They wanted to strip me of my identity and kick me out into the cold, leaving me feeling worthless. But Marianne Holt had turned the lights on. I looked out at the crowd again. Really looked at them. In my shock during the first few minutes, I had seen a sea of familiar faces. Aunt Linda, Uncle Bob, the Hendersons next door. But now, as my vision cleared and the adrenaline sharpened my senses, I realized something that made my stomach drop. The crowd was not just family and neighbors. Scattered among the familiar faces were strangers, people I had never seen in my life. Near the refrigerator stood a man in a sharp navy suit, holding a tablet, looking bored but attentive. By the back door, 2 women in stiff blazers were whispering to each other, their eyes darting between me and Graham. They didn't look like party guests. They didn't hold drinks. They held silence. They looked like auditors, or lawyers, or adjusters. My parents hadn't just invited the neighborhood to witness my humiliation. They had invited professional witnesses. They had invited people to certify the separation, to make sure the business deal was closed legally and irrevocably. My gaze drifted to the far wall, near the entrance to the dining room. There was a man standing there who didn't fit either category. He wasn't a neighbor, and he wasn't a corporate shark in a suit. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s. He wore a faded plaid shirt and a thick wool beanie that looked out of place indoors. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of a worn jacket, but it was his face that caught me. Everyone else in the room was looking at me with judgment, curiosity, or pity. This man was looking at me with pure, unadulterated devastation. His eyes were rimmed with red, watery and bloodshot. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He looked like he was at a funeral. When our eyes met, he flinched physically, as if I had burned him. He immediately turned his head away, pulling the beanie lower, trying to shrink into the wallpaper. Who was he? Why was he crying? "Get out!" Graham roared again, snapping my attention back to the center of the room. He was losing control of his party, and he knew it. "Everyone out. The show is over." "Not quite," Marianne said. She walked straight up to me, invading my personal space in a way that should have felt threatening but instead felt like a shield wall being erected. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, heavy card stock rectangle, a business card. She pressed it into my hand, her fingers lingering on mine for a second. Her skin was warm, a stark contrast to the chill in the room. She leaned in close, her mouth inches from my ear. The smell of expensive perfume and coffee wafted off her. "Do not sign anything," she whispered, her voice a rush of urgent air against my skin. "Do not agree to any settlements. Do not acknowledge any debts. And for God's sake, Sophia, do not leave this driveway alone." She pulled back before I could ask her what she meant. Why shouldn't I leave alone? Was I in danger? "We will be in touch. Mr. Barnes," Marianne said loudly, addressing my father one last time. "Expect a subpoena by morning." She turned on her heel and began to walk toward the garage door, the crowd parting for her like the Red Sea. I stood frozen, clutching the handle of my duffel bag in one hand and Marianne's card in the other. The room was buzzing now. The silence had broken, replaced by a low, feverish murmur of gossip. "Did you hear that? A trust fund? Fraud? I told you Graham was up to something." I looked at my mother. Elaine was still standing by the kitchen island, but she was no longer looking at the floor. She was looking at the guests, her eyes darting frantically from face to face, trying to gauge the damage. "We had to do it this way," she muttered. Though she wasn't speaking to me, she was speaking to the air, to the universe, to the jury she had assembled. "We had to have people here." She looked at me then, and for a second, the mask slipped. I saw the fear beneath the ice. "They are here to witness that we followed the protocol," Elaine hissed, her voice trembling with a bizarre mixture of righteousness and panic. "So no one can say we were cruel. So no one can say we kicked you out without notice. We gave you the facts. We gave you the bag. We are good people." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The cruelty was not a byproduct of their actions. The cruelty was the design. They hadn't invited these people to celebrate me. They hadn't even invited them to simply watch me leave. They had invited them to immunize themselves. They wanted a public record that they had discharged the asset responsibly. They wanted 73 alibis. They wanted to be able to go to church next Sunday and say, "We were honest with her. We gave her everything she needed to know. We even threw a gathering." I looked at the cake again. The knife, the forks. They had prepared a feast for my execution. "You're sick," I whispered. It was the first time I had ever spoken to my mother without respect. "You are both sick." Elaine stiffened. "Go," she said, pointing to the garage. "Just go." I didn't need to be told twice. The air in the house was suddenly unbreathable. I turned and walked toward the garage door, my boots heavy on the floor. I passed the neighbors who had watched me grow up. Mrs. Gable, who had taught me piano, the lessons listed in the folder as a wasted expenditure, looked down at her purse as I passed. Mr. Henderson pretended to examine a stain on the carpet. I walked past the man in the beanie. He was still facing the wall, his shoulders shaking slightly. I wanted to stop. I wanted to ask him who he was, but Marianne's voice echoed in my head. Do not leave this driveway alone. I pushed through the door into the cool, oil-smelling air of the garage. I didn't stop. I walked straight out into the driveway, the cold October wind hitting my face, drying the sweat on my forehead. My car was blocked in. Of course, the driveway was packed. I couldn't leave even if I wanted to. I was trapped in the driveway of the people who had just erased me. I stood there, the wind whipping my hair across my face, clutching my bag of essentials and the dossier of my debts. The front door of the house opened, and people started spilling out, the party breaking up in awkward haste. They flowed around me like water around a stone, avoiding eye contact, hurrying to their cars to escape the scene of the crime. But one car didn't leave. A black SUV was idling at the curb, its headlights cutting through the gloom. The window rolled down. It was Marianne Holt. "Get in," she said. It wasn't a request. I looked back at the house. My father was standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the light of the hallway. He watched me, his arms crossed, checking his watch. He was probably calculating how many minutes of the 1-hour notice had elapsed. I looked at the SUV. I looked at the stranger who knew more about my life than I did. I didn't know who the Langfords were. I didn't know if I could trust Marianne Holt. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The people in that house were not my family. They were my creditors, and I was done paying. I walked toward the black SUV, leaving the driveway of 42 Birchwood Lane for the last time. As I reached for the door handle, I glanced back one last time. The old man in the beanie had just exited the garage. He stood at the edge of the driveway, under the harsh yellow glow of the street lamp. He wasn't looking at his car. He was looking at me. And as our eyes met across the distance, he raised one hand in a small, tragic wave. Then he turned and walked into the darkness, vanishing as if he had never been there at all. The walk from the garage to my car felt less like an exit and more like a procession through a graveyard where the ghosts were still breathing. I moved through the clusters of people lingering in the driveway. My aunt, my cousins, the neighbors who had known me since I was tall enough to reach the mailbox. They parted from me, but not out of respect. They moved away as if I were contagious. I was no longer Sophia, the successful niece or the polite girl from next door. I was a canceled contract. I was a bad investment that had finally been liquidated. I gripped the handle of my duffel bag so hard my fingers cramped. Refusing to meet their eyes, I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Not here, not in front of the witnesses. I don't remember starting the engine. I don't remember the exact mechanics of how the cars were moved or how I navigated out of the cul-de-sac. The next hour was a blur of highway lights smearing against the windshield and the rhythmic thumping of tires on asphalt. I drove without a destination, my body operating on a survival autopilot that bypassed my brain entirely. I was just a physical object moving through space, disconnected from the person I had been when I woke up that morning. Hunger hit me around 2 a.m, not as an appetite, but as a violent, hollow ache in my stomach. I pulled into a 24-hour diner off the interstate, a place with flickering neon signage and windows that looked like they hadn't been washed since the 90s. I parked, turned off the car, and just sat there for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The silence inside the car was terrifying because it left room for my thoughts to catch up with me. I grabbed my purse and the folder. I couldn't leave it behind. I physically couldn't let it out of my sight, and went inside. The diner smelled of burnt coffee, industrial cleaner, and bacon grease. It was a sensory assault that felt grounding. It was real. It was gritty. It was the opposite of the sterile, performative cruelty of my parents' kitchen. I slid into a booth with red vinyl seats that were cracked and taped over with duct tape. A waitress with tired eyes and a name tag that read Barb tossed a laminated menu in front of me. "Coffee?" she asked, not looking up from her notepad. "Yes," I said, "and I want the Belgian waffle with the strawberry compote. and a side of chili cheese fries, and a chocolate milkshake. Barb paused, her pen hovering over the paper. She looked at me then, really looked at me. She took in my expensive charcoal blazer, my silk blouse, and the utter devastation that must have been written on my face. "Rough night, hun?" she asked. "You have no idea," I replied. Coming right up, when the food arrived, it was a grotesque amount of sugar and grease, a chaotic spread that no sane 30-year-old would order. I ate it with a mechanical efficiency. I shoveled the waffle into my mouth, the sweetness cloying and artificial, followed by the salty, heavy fries. I needed to feel something. I needed to spike my blood sugar or clog my arteries. Anything to remind my body that it was still alive, still functioning, despite having been declared null and void. 3 hours ago. I pushed the plate away and pulled the folder onto the sticky table. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, the paper looked even more clinical. I opened it to the second page. Subject: Sophia Barnes. Probability of maternity: 0.00%. I traced the zeros with my fingertip. It was such a clean number. Mathematics didn't lie, and it didn't have feelings. It just was. That number had erased 30 years of history. It meant that every time I had been told I had my father's nose or my mother's work ethic, it was a fabrication. It meant that my medical history was a blank slate. It meant that technically, I was sitting in a diner in the middle of the night with no name, no lineage, and no home. I looked at the cost log again. The total at the bottom, $642,000, stared back at me. I wondered if they had included the cost of the gas they used to drive me to the hospital when I broke my arm. I checked the list. Yes, there it was. Mileage reimbursement, 19 cents per mile. I closed the folder. I couldn't look at it anymore, but I couldn't throw it away. It was the only proof I had that my life had actually happened. I pulled out my phone. It was full of unread birthday texts from friends and colleagues. Happy big 3-0. Hope you're celebrating. Can't wait to see you Monday. Monday. I worked at North Glass Strategy Group. I was a senior associate. I had a team. I had responsibilities. The idea of walking into that glass-walled office, sitting in my ergonomic chair, and discussing fourth-quarter projections seemed so absurd, so utterly impossible, that I almost laughed out loud. How could I care about market shares when I had just been informed that my existence was an accounting error? I opened my email app and composed a message to my managing director. Subject: Emergency leave of absence. I stared at the blinking cursor. What was the truth? Dear Sarah, I can't come in today because my parents just handed me a bill for my childhood and told me I was switched at birth. No, that sounded like a psychotic break. That sounded like something you get committed for. I typed, I have come down with a severe case of food poisoning following a family dinner. I need to take the week off to recover. I will be unavailable by phone. It wasn't a lie, really. I had been poisoned. I had swallowed a toxicity so potent it was currently dissolving my organs from the inside out. I hit send. I spent the next 3 days in a Motel 6 before I found a place. I couldn't go back to my apartment in the city. It felt too exposed, too connected to the Sophia Barnes who had a life. I needed a cave. I found a studio apartment in St. Paul, in a converted warehouse district that was still in the early, gritty stages of gentrification. It was small, smelling faintly of sawdust and fresh paint, with exposed brick walls that crumbled if you brushed against them too hard. I moved in with nothing but my duffel bag and a few boxes I bought from a hardware store. I spent the first 2 nights sleeping on a mattress on the floor because I couldn't summon the energy to order a bed frame. The first time I went to Target to buy essentials, I had a panic attack in the towel aisle. I was standing there, surrounded by plush cotton in every conceivable shade: navy, teal, charcoal, sage. I reached for a navy blue towel. My bathroom at home had always been navy blue. And then I stopped. Did I like navy blue? Or did I just tolerate it because it was what Elaine liked? Elaine preferred dark colors because they didn't show dirt. Elaine liked order. Elaine liked practical things. I looked at a bright yellow towel. Did I like yellow? It seemed too loud. What about pink? Too girlish. I stood there for 20 minutes, paralyzed by the realization that I didn't know the most basic things about myself, my preferences, my tastes, my habits. How many of them were mine, and how many were just adaptations to the environment I had been raised in. I was a mirror that had been reflecting Graham and Elaine for 30 years. Now that they were gone, I had no reflection. I bought gray towels. Gray was neutral. Gray was safe. Gray was the color of the nothingness I felt inside. Living in the studio was strange. The silence was different from the silence in my parents' house. At home, the silence was heavy, pregnant with judgment and the fear of doing something wrong. Here, the silence was just empty. It was the silence of a vacuum. I spent hours sitting on the floor, staring at the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light coming through the single window. I didn't watch TV. I didn't read. I just existed. On the fourth day, my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I knew who it was before I unlocked the screen. Marianne Holt. The Langfords would like to meet you. They are anxious, but I want to give you a piece of advice. Off the record. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the glass. Marianne Holt. They are grieving. They lost a daughter. Do not let them turn you into a replacement. You are not a bandage for their wound. I read the text 3 times. The Langfords, my biological family, the people who had apparently been looking for me while my parents were tallying my expenses. I felt a flicker of curiosity, but it was buried under layers of caution. Marianne was right. I wasn't a puzzle piece they could just slot into their lives to make the picture whole again. I was damaged goods. I texted back. Not yet. Give me a week. I started seeing a therapist the next day. I found her online. A woman named Doctor, heiress with a kind face and an office that didn't smell like sterilization. I sat on her beige couch, clutching my purse, and tried to explain why I was there. How does that make you feel? She asked, after I'd given her the clinical summary of the birthday party. I don't know, I said. Sad? Angry? Betrayed? No, I said, shaking my head. Those are human feelings. I don't feel human right now. I feel like a line item. I feel like a transaction that's been voided. Doctor, Aris made a note on her pad. You're experiencing depersonalization. It's a defense mechanism. It's not a defense, I snapped, the first spark of anger I had felt in days. It's the truth. They didn't just kick me out. They presented a business case for why I wasn't worth keeping. How do you process that? What is the name for the emotion you feel when your mother looks at you and you realize she isn't seeing a person? She's seeing a sunk cost? That was the image that haunted me. Not the spreadsheet, not the stranger in the camel coat. It was Elaine's face, every night. When I tried to sleep on my mattress on the floor, I saw her. I saw her standing by the kitchen island, looking down at the floor as Graham read the numbers. She hadn't looked ashamed. Shame implies a conscience. Shame implies that you know you are doing something wrong. She had looked bored. She had looked like she was waiting for a tedious meeting to end so she could go back to her real life. She had looked at the floor the same way she looked at a stain on the carpet. Something that needed to be removed so the house could be perfect again. I kept the cost log in the top drawer of the cheap plywood dresser I had bought. I didn't open it, but I knew it was there. It felt like it was radioactive. Sometimes, I would open the drawer just to make sure it was still real, to make sure I hadn't hallucinated the whole thing. One evening, I sat on the floor with a glass of cheap wine. Not the expensive Cabernet I had brought to the party, but something bitter and acidic. I looked at the gray towels hanging in the bathroom. I looked at the unopened boxes. I looked at my hands. I was 30 years old. I had a career I didn't care about. I had a family that had erased me. And somewhere out there was a wealthy family waiting to see if I looked enough like their dead daughter to make them feel better. I took a sip of the wine. It tasted terrible. Okay, I said to the empty room. Okay. I didn't know what I was agreeing to. Maybe I was agreeing to survive. Maybe I was agreeing to the fact that Sophia Barnes was dead. And whoever was living in this apartment was someone entirely new. Someone who had to build herself from scratch, brick by brick, without a blueprint. The only thing I knew for sure was that I wasn't going to be anyone's investment ever again. I was going to be the auditor, and I had a lot of work to do. The waiting room of Marianne Holt's law firm was quiet enough to hear the hum of the central air conditioning. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of my internal monologue. I sat on a leather chair that cost more than my first car, my hands folded tightly in my lap, staring at a piece of abstract art on the wall that looked like a storm at sea. It felt appropriate. Marianne had set the meeting for 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. I had told my boss I was still recovering from food poisoning, a lie that tasted sour on my tongue, but I could not focus on spreadsheets when my entire identity was being renegotiated in a downtown high-rise. "They are here," Marianne said, stepping out of her office. She looked impeccable, as always, in a sharp charcoal suit that made her look like a warrior monk of the legal world. "Remember what I said. Sophia, listen, observe. You owe them nothing." I nodded. Standing up, my legs felt heavy. I walked into the conference room, and for the second time in a week, I walked into a room where people were waiting to judge me. The Langfords did not look like the monsters my parents were. They did not look like people who kept spreadsheets of diaper costs. They stood by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the Minneapolis skyline. Silhouetted against the gray autumn light, there were two of them. The man, whom Marianne introduced as Elias Langford, was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a soft cashmere sweater and slacks that spoke of money that didn't need to shout. He had a kind face, weathered by what looked like years of outdoor living, perhaps on a boat or a golf course, but it was the woman, Celeste, who commanded the gravity of the room. She was petite, fragile-looking, with hair the color of spun gold that was just beginning to fade into silver. She turned as I entered, and the expression on her face broke my heart before I could even guard it. It was a look of pure, agonizing hunger. "Oh," she breathed. It wasn't a word. It was an exhale of a lifetime of holding her breath. Before I could introduce myself, before I could offer a handshake or establish a boundary. She crossed the room in 3 strides and collided with me. She wrapped her arms around me, burying her face in the crook of my neck. She smelled of expensive lavender soap and something else, something sterile, like grief. Her grip was not the polite embrace of a stranger. It was desperate. She squeezed me as if she were trying to physically merge our bodies, as if she could absorb me into her skin and correct the mistake of 30 years ago through sheer force of will. I stood there, stiff as a board, my arms hovering awkwardly at my sides. I didn't know how to hug her back. I didn't know this woman. "Celeste," Elias said softly, stepping forward and placing a hand on his wife's shoulder. "Give her room." Celeste pulled back, but she didn't let go of my arms. She held me at arm's length, her eyes scanning my face with a frantic intensity. She was looking for something. She was checking the slope of my nose, the color of my eyes, the shape of my chin. She was looking for herself. "You have Elias's eyes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Marianne said the markers were a match, but seeing you, it is real." "Mrs. Langford," I said, my voice sounding professional and detached, a defense mechanism I had honed at Northglass. "It is nice to meet you." "Celeste," she corrected immediately. "Please, call me Celeste." We sat down at the long mahogany table. Marianne sat at the head, acting as the mediator, the referee in a game I didn't know the rules to. "I know this is overwhelming," Elias said, his voice deep and steady. "We don't want to rush you, but we have been looking for so long." "Marianne mentioned a hospital error," I said, keeping my tone neutral, "and a genetic test." Elias nodded. He reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a photograph. He slid it across the table toward me. "This was Harper," he said. I looked at the photo. It was a candid shot of a young woman, roughly my age, laughing on the deck of a sailboat. She was beautiful, with dark curly hair and a smile that consumed her face. She looked vibrant. She looked happy. "She passed away last year," Celeste said. her voice cracking. A heart condition, congenital. We didn't know about it until it was too late. It was sudden. I felt a pang of sympathy, but it was distant, like reading about a tragedy in the newspaper. I am very sorry for your loss. When she died, Elias continued, we had genetic testing done. To see if the heart condition was hereditary, we wanted to know if our nieces or nephews were at risk. He paused, looking down at his hands. The results showed that Harper was not biologically related to either of us. I stared at the photo of the dead girl. Harper, the girl who had lived my life, the girl who had grown up in the house by the lake, who had been loved, who had been hugged without a cost log attached. And then, I saw it. It hit me so hard I almost gasped. I leaned closer to the photo, studying the girl's face, the dark curls, the shape of the brow bone, the specific, slightly sharp curve of the nose. I knew that face. I had seen that face every day for 30 years, usually looking at me with disappointment. Harper didn't look like me. Harper looked like Elaine. A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. If Harper was Elaine's biological daughter, then the switch at the hospital wasn't just a random swap of two babies. It was a perfect exchange. She looks like the woman who raised me, I said quietly. Marianne looked up from her notes, her eyes sharp. We suspect as much. We are still gathering the visual evidence to confirm the secondary link. Celeste reached out and touched my hand. Pulling my attention back to her, she wasn't interested in Elaine. She was only interested in the void Harper had left. Tell me about you, Celeste said, her eyes wide and pleading. What do you love? Do you ride horses? Harper was a champion equestrian. We have a stable at the house in Minnetonka. No, I said. I've never been on a horse. My parents, the people who raised me, didn't believe in hobbies that required expensive equipment. Oh, Celeste said, a flicker of disappointment crossing her face. Well, that can change. What about sailing? Do you like the water? Elias has a boat on Lake Superior. We spend our summers there. I work most summers, I said. I'm a strategist. I work 60-hour weeks. But what is your passion? Celeste pressed. Do you paint? Do you play the cello? I felt a tightening in my chest. These questions weren't just curiosity. They were a checklist. She was trying to see if I fit the silhouette of the daughter she had lost. She was trying to see if I could step into Harper's life, put on her riding boots, sail her boat, and fill the silence in their large, empty house. I like to read, I said flatly, and I'm good at math. That's about it. It was a lie. I used to love painting when I was 7, until Graham told me art supplies were a waste of capital. But I didn't want to give her that. I didn't want to give her anything that she could use to mold me. Math, Elias said, nodding approvingly. That's good. The trust requires a certain financial literacy. Marianne cleared her throat. The sound was deliberate, a signal that we were moving from the emotional to the transactional. That brings us to the administrative side of things, Marianne said. She opened a file in front of her. Sophia, as I mentioned at the house, there is a trust, the Langford Family Trust. I don't need money, I said quickly. I have a job. I have savings. It is not about need, Marianne said. It is about the structure of the estate. When Harper passed, the trust that was set up for her, a trust established by Elias's father, was frozen. She slid a document toward me. It was thick, full of legal jargon. The terms of the grandfather's will are very specific, Marianne explained, tapping a paragraph on the 3rd page. The beneficiary must be a direct biological descendant. When the DNA test revealed Harper was not biological, the assets were locked. The bank froze everything. I looked at Elias. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at the document. The trust, Elias said, his voice tight. Funds our charitable foundation. It maintains the estate. It supports a lot of things. Without a verified biological heir, the capital dissolves and goes to the state after a certain period. The air in the room changed. The warmth of Celeste's lavender perfume seemed to evaporate, replaced by the cold, hard scent of necessity. "So," I said slowly, putting the pieces together, "you didn't just look for me because you wanted your daughter back. You looked for me because, without me, you lose the money." "That is not fair," Celeste said, her voice rising. "We wanted you. The money is just complicated legal nonsense. We would have looked for you even if we were penniless." "Would you?" I asked. I didn't mean to sound so cynical, but the wound from Graham's spreadsheet was still fresh. "You spent 18 months tracking down a hospital error from 1996. That takes resources, that takes investigators, that takes a level of desperation that usually has a dollar sign attached to it." Elias sighed, rubbing his temples. "Sophia, we are not your parents. We are not the people who wrote down the cost of your diapers. Please don't confuse us with them." "I'm not," I said. "But I am trying to understand my value here. Am I a daughter? Or am I a key to unlock a bank account?" "You are our child," Celeste said firmly. She reached for my hand again, but this time I pulled it back. "We missed 30 years of your life. We just want to know you. We want to bring you home." "Home," I repeated. "To the room where Harper slept?" Celeste flinched. "We haven't changed it," she admitted softly. "It is ready for you." I felt a wave of nausea. They wanted me to move into a dead girl's room. They wanted me to ride her horse. They wanted me to be Harper, version 2.0, with the correct DNA to satisfy the bank. I looked at Marianne. She was watching me closely, her face unreadable. She had warned me, "Do not let them turn you into a replacement." "I need time," I said, standing up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I just lost my family 5 days ago. I'm not ready to interview for a new one." "It's not an interview," Elias said, standing up as well. "It felt like one," I said. "You asked me if I ride horses before you asked me if I was happy." The silence that followed was heavy. Celeste looked like she was about to cry again. Elias looked defeated. "I will think about the DNA test," I said to Marianne. "I will think about the trust, but I'm not moving into anyone's house, and I am definitely not getting on a horse." I turned and walked toward the door. I needed air. I needed to get away from the suffocating expectations of people who claimed to love me but didn't know me at all. I walked out of the conference room and into the long, plush hallway of the law firm. I was walking fast, my heels clicking on the marble floor, my vision slightly blurred by tears of frustration. And then I stopped. Standing near the elevator bank, pretending to read a framed certificate on the wall, was a man. He was wearing a janitor's uniform, pushing a cart full of cleaning supplies, but I recognized the profile. I recognized the stoop of the shoulders. It was the man from the party, the man in the beanie, the man with the red eyes who had waved at me in the driveway. He looked up as I approached. His eyes went wide. He wasn't supposed to be seen. "You," I said, stopping a few feet away from him. "You were at the house." He looked around nervously, checking to see if anyone was watching. "I'm just the cleaning staff here, miss." "No, you're not," I said. "You were at my parents' house. You were crying. Who are you?" Before he could answer, the door to the conference room opened behind me. Marianne stepped out. She saw me standing there, confronting the janitor. Her eyes darted to the man, and her expression tightened into something sharp and warning. "Mr. Reed," Marianne said, her voice crisp and authoritative. "I believe the break room on the 4th floor needs attention, immediately." The man, Mr. Reed, nodded quickly, ducking his head. He gripped the handle of his cleaning cart. "Yes, Ms. Holt, right away." He hurried past me, refusing to meet my eyes, the wheels of his cart squeaking on the marble. I turned to Marianne. "You know him. He works for the building," Marianne said, her face smoothing back into a mask of professional indifference. "He is harmless. He was at my birthday party," I insisted. "He was the only one who looked sad, and now he is here, at your office? That is not a coincidence. Marianne sighed. She walked over to me, lowering her voice. Sophia, you are in the middle of a very complex storm. Not everyone who is watching you is an enemy, but not everyone is a friend, either. She handed me a folder, a different one this time. Take the trust documents home, read them, look at the clauses. And when you are ready to stop reacting and start investigating, call me. She pressed the call button for the elevator. And Sophia? She added. Just as the door slid open. If Mr. Reed tries to talk to you again, listen to him, but don't let anyone see you doing it. I stepped into the elevator, the metal doors closing between us, leaving me alone with my reflection in the polished steel. I looked at myself. I didn't look like an heiress. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like someone who was slowly realizing that the rabbit hole didn't end at the DNA test. It went much, much deeper. The fluorescent lights of the Brightvale Medical Center Records Department hummed with a sound that drilled straight into my temples. I had been standing at the counter for 45 minutes, watching a woman named Brenda type slowly on a keyboard that looked like it belonged in a museum. The room smelled of dust and toner, a dry, suffocating scent that made me want to cough. I am sorry, Ms. Barnes, Brenda said, not looking up. But like I said, 1996 was a transition year for our filing system. We moved from physical microfiche to the digital server in 1998. There is a gap. A gap? I asked, gripping the edge of the counter. I was born here. I have a birth certificate issued by this hospital. You cannot tell me my medical file just fell into a hole. It is archived, Brenda said, finally stopping her typing to give me a tired look. She adjusted her glasses. And to access the deep archive, I need a supervisor's approval, and the supervisor is at a conference in Chicago until next Tuesday. It was a wall, a soft, bureaucratic wall made of excuses and procedure. I had spent the last decade in corporate strategy. I knew a stall tactic when I heard one. They were not looking for the file because they did not want to find it. I don't need the whole file, I said, keeping my voice level. I just need the intake logs for the maternity ward for October 12th through October 14th, 1996. That is public record, isn't it? Just the admissions, Brenda sighed, a long, heavy exhale that rattled her chest. It is not that simple. We had a situation with the labeling protocols back then. The legal department has flagged that entire quarter. My ears pricked up. What kind of situation? Brenda blinked, realizing she had said too much. She went back to typing, faster this time. Just a system migration issue. Look, fill out this form, Form 82B, and we will mail you a copy of what we find in 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks? I repeated. I might not have 6 to 8 weeks. That is the best I can do. I took the form. I didn't fill it out. I walked over to the water cooler in the corner, pretending to get a drink, and watched Brenda. She was on the phone now. Her voice hushed. Yes, she is here, Brenda whispered. Asking about the October 96 logs. No, I didn't give her anything, but the system is flagging the wristband report again. Do I need to alert risk management? The wristband report. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a known incident. A report implied an investigation. It implied that back in 1996, someone knew that babies were being mixed up, and instead of fixing it, they had buried it in a deep archive that required a supervisor who was conveniently in Chicago. I walked out of the hospital without the file, but I had something better. I had a confirmation. The mistake that Marianne Holt spoke about wasn't a random accident. It was a cover-up. I drove back to my studio apartment in St. Paul, the city blurring past me. The traffic on Interstate 94 was heavy, a river of red taillights that stretched for miles. My phone sat on the passenger seat, silent. I hadn't heard from my parents, from Graham and Elaine, since the night of the party. No apology, no demand for the house key I still had on my ring. Just silence. When I got to the apartment, I didn't turn on the lights. I liked the dark. It made the glowing screen of my laptop feel more focused, like a spotlight on a stage. I pulled the cost log out of the drawer. For the first few days, I had looked at this document as a diary of my trauma. I had read the entries about piano lessons and braces and felt the sting of rejection. But tonight, I wasn't looking at it as a daughter. I was looking at it as an auditor. I turned on my desk lamp and spread the pages out on the floor. I grabbed a highlighter. "Okay," I muttered to myself. "Let's see what you really cost." I started looking for patterns. The small expenses, food, clothes, school supplies, were consistent. But then there were the outliers. December 28th, 1999. Medical reimbursement, asthma treatment, $2,000. I frowned. I didn't have asthma. I had never used an inhaler in my life. April 10th, 2003. Educational grant offset, $5,000. I scanned the dates. Every significant reimbursement or offset entry appeared in late December or early April, end of the tax year, tax filing season. I picked up my phone and dialed Kevin. Kevin was a forensic accountant I had dated briefly in my 20s. We weren't romantic anymore, but he owed me a favor for helping him rewrite his resume last year. "Sophia?" He answered on the second ring. "I haven't heard from you in ages. Is everything okay?" "No," I said honestly. "Kevin, I need you to look at some numbers for me. Hypothetically." "Okay," he said, his voice shifting into professional mode. "Shoot. If I gave you a ledger of child-rearing expenses that included line items for tax offsets and medical reimbursements for conditions the child never had, what would you call that?" There was a pause on the line. "I would call that tax fraud," Kevin said. "Why?" "And what if the parents kept this ledger for 30 years, detailed, down to the cent?" "That is weird," Kevin said. "Normal people don't do that. You only keep records that detailed if you're preparing for an audit, or if you are treating the child as a business expense. Is this about a client?" "Sort of," I lied. "What if they listed a $5,000 deduction for a dependent care credit in a year where the income limit should have disqualified them?" "Then they are cooking the books," Kevin said. "They are using the kid as a tax shelter. Listen, Sophia, if those reimbursements were claimed against an insurance policy or a flexible spending account for medical issues that didn't exist, that is insurance fraud. 2, that is a felony." I looked at the entry for the asthma treatment again. Graham had claimed $2,000 for a sickness I never had. He had likely submitted a fake receipt to his insurance or his employer's benefits program, pocketed the cash, and then logged it as a cost associated with me to balance his own internal books. "Thanks, Kevin," I said. "You have been a huge help. Sophia, be careful," he warned. "If this is real, whoever kept those books is dangerous. People go to prison for this stuff." I hung up. My hands were shaking. This wasn't just about resentment. This wasn't just about Graham and Elaine feeling burdened by a child that wasn't theirs. This was systematic. They hadn't just kept me. They had used me. I was a walking, talking tax deduction. I was a vehicle for 30 years of petty larceny. I was about to close the folder when my phone buzzed. A text from Marianne. "Marianne, do not trust the silence. They are building a narrative. My sources tell me Graham has contacted a family law attorney who specializes in retroactive damages." I stared at the screen. Retroactive damages? I called her. She picked up immediately. "What does that mean?" I asked, skipping the hello. "It means," Marianne said, her voice sharp and clear, "that they are not just trying to cut you off. They are trying to prove that your presence in their home caused them financial distress. They want to sue the hospital, and potentially the Langford estate, for the cost of raising the wrong child, and they are using that ledger as their primary evidence." "They want to get paid for raising me?" I asked, my stomach turning. "They want to be reimbursed," Marianne corrected. "They are framing you as a liability, a defective product they were forced to maintain. If they can prove that you were a financial drain, they can claim damages for loss of lifestyle or undue burden." "But that is insane," I said. "I worked since I was 16. I paid for my own books in college." "Does the ledger show that?" Marianne asked. I looked down at the spreadsheet. It didn't. It listed the tuition as a cost. It didn't list the checks I wrote them from my waitressing tips as a credit. It was a one-sided narrative. No, I whispered. Exactly, Marianne said. They are rewriting history. Sophia, you need to find your own paper trail. Did you ever sign anything? Loans? Accounts? No, I said. Never. Are you sure? The question hung in the air. Was I sure? I trusted them. I trusted them when they put a piece of paper in front of me and said, "Sign here. It is just for the school trip." I trusted them when they said, "Sign here. It is just for the insurance." "I need to go," I said. I hung up and opened my laptop. I navigated to a credit monitoring site. I had checked my credit score when I bought my car 3 years ago, but I hadn't looked at the detailed report since then. I typed in my social security number, my date of birth. The loading wheel spun. Round and round. The report popped up. Score, 780. Good. I clicked on Open Accounts. There was my car loan. There was my credit card. I scrolled down to Closed Accounts. There was a student loan I had paid off. And then, there was something else. Personal loan. Lender. Horizon Valley Bank. Opened. June 10th, 2018. Amount, $15,000. Status, paid in full. 2018. I was 22. I was fresh out of college, living in a cramped apartment with 2 roommates, eating instant noodles. I didn't take out a $15,000 loan. I didn't even have a reason to. I clicked on the details. The loan was taken out in my name, using my social security number, but the address listed was 42 Birchwood Lane, my parents' house. My heart hammered against my ribs. I navigated to the Documents tab. Most banks didn't upload the actual signed contracts, but Horizon Valley was a small regional bank. Sometimes they digitized everything. I clicked View Promissory Note. A PDF downloaded. I opened it. There was my name at the top. Sophia Barnes. There was the interest rate. 6%. There was the purpose of the loan. Home improvement. I scrolled to the bottom. There was a signature. Sophia Barnes. I stared at it. It looked like my name. It was spelled correctly, but the S was wrong. I wrote my S with a sharp loop at the top. A habit I had picked up in architecture class in high school. This S was round, bulbous. It looped at the bottom, dragging the tail of the letter into the O. I knew that S. I had seen that S on permission slips. I had seen it on checks written to the grocery store. I had seen it on the bottom of the birthday cards that were always signed from Dad. It was Graham's handwriting. He had forged my signature. He had taken out a $15,000 loan in my name, effectively stealing my identity. To pay for what? Home improvement? That was the year they remodeled the kitchen where they had stood 5 days ago and told me I was a burden. I felt a cold, hard rage settle in my chest. It wasn't the hot, tearful anger of the birthday party. This was different. This was clarify. They hadn't just kicked me out because of the DNA. The DNA was convenient. The DNA was a way to sever the tie before I figured it out. If I had ever looked closely at my credit, if I had ever tried to buy a house and needed a deep dive, I would have found this. I would have found the fraud. They needed me gone. They needed me discredited. They needed to paint me as a stranger, an interloper, someone whose word couldn't be trusted, so that when I inevitably found the financial abuse, no one would believe me. "You didn't just invest in me," I whispered to the empty room. "You leveraged me." I grabbed my phone and took a picture of the screen. Then I downloaded the PDF and emailed it to myself, to Marianne, and to a new, encrypted email address I had just created. I stood up and walked to the window. St. Paul was dark, the streetlights casting long, orange shadows on the pavement. I remembered something else, a memory from when I was 16. Graham had come into my room with a stack of papers. "Sophia, we are opening a savings account for your future," he had said. "Just sign here. It is a custodial account. We will put money in it for your wedding someday." I had signed. I was 16. I was grateful. I thought my father was looking out for me. I never saw that account again. I never saw a statement. When I turned 18, I asked about it, and he brushed it off. The market is down, he had said. Best not to look at it. I went back to the computer. I couldn't access that account because I didn't have the account number. But I knew who did, Marianne. If the Langford investigation was as thorough as she claimed, they would have pulled Graham's assets. They would have seen the transfers. I dialed Marianne again. You found something, she said. She didn't sound surprised. He forged my signature on a loan in 2018, I said. And I think he emptied a custodial account that was in my name. Send me the document, Marianne said. I could hear the click of a keyboard in the background. She was already working. Marianne, I said, my voice steady. They aren't just greedy. They are criminals. Yes, Marianne said softly. And criminals make mistakes when they get panicked. That birthday party? That was a panic move. They wanted to control the narrative before the Langfords made contact. They wanted to discard you before you became a witness. Well, I said, looking at the fake signature on the screen, the loop of the S mocking me. It is too late for that. What do you want to do? Marianne asked. I thought about the man in the beanie at the hospital. I thought about the wristband report hidden in the deep archive. I thought about the kitchen remodel paid for with my credit score. I want the original birth records, I said. The ones the hospital is hiding. Can you get a subpoena? I can get a court order by Friday, Marianne promised. Good, I said, because I'm not just fighting for a trust fund anymore. I'm fighting for my name. I hung up. I looked at the cost log on the floor. I didn't put it back in the drawer. I taped the page with the tax offset to my wall. Next to it, I taped the printout of the forged loan. It wasn't a tragedy anymore. It was an investigation board. And I was the lead detective. The phone rang 4 times before my mother picked up. I sat in my car, parked in the shadowed corner of a parking structure downtown. Watching the rain streak the windshield, I needed to hear her voice. I needed to hear the tone of the woman who had raised me to see if I could detect the fraud I had found on the PDF document. Hello? Elaine's voice was clipped, impatient. She sounded like she was in the middle of something more important than talking to the daughter she had just evicted. I saw the loan, Mom, I said. I didn't bother with greetings. The $15,000 from Horizon Valley Bank, the one for home improvements in 2018. There was a silence on the other end. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of calculation. I don't know what you are talking about, she said, her voice smooth and practiced. The signature is Dad's, I pressed, my grip on the steering wheel tightening. You used my credit to renovate the kitchen. That isn't reimbursement. Mom, that is theft. That is a felony. Sophia, she sighed, the sound of a parent tired of a toddler's tantrum. You are making this very difficult. We were a family. Families share burdens. We needed that money to maintain the house you were living in. Technically, it was for your benefit. I didn't live there in 2018, I countered. I was in an apartment in the city. I was paying my own rent. You don't understand adult matters, she said dismissively. You never did. You think the world is black and white, but it isn't. It is about survival. Just stop digging. Sophia, for your own sake. The line went dead. She hadn't denied it. She had justified it. You don't understand adult matters. It was the same thing she used to say when I asked why we never went on vacations, or why Graham was always locked in his study with the door shut. I lowered the phone, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. I wasn't just a daughter to them. I was a resource. I was an asset class to be liquidated when cash flow was low. I opened my laptop, tethering it to my phone's hotspot. I needed to understand the adult matters she was talking about. I navigated to the Public Court Records database for Hennepin County and expanded my search to federal filings. If they were desperate enough to forge my signature for $15,000, there had to be a bigger fire they were trying to put out. It took me 20 minutes to find it. It wasn't a criminal case. It was a civil suit, filed 3 weeks ago. Plaintiff: Red River Capital Partners. Defendant: Graham Barnes and the Cedar Point Venture LC. I read the filing summary. Graham was the principal on a commercial real estate development that had gone belly up. He had leveraged everything. He had borrowed against the house, against his retirement, and apparently, against his unwitting daughter's credit score. The investors were suing him for mismanagement of funds. They were coming for his personal assets. I sat back, the air in the car feeling suddenly thin. The cost log, the birthday party, the public spectacle. It finally made sense. Graham wasn't just being cruel, he was building a defense. If he could prove that he had spent $600,000 raising a child who wasn't his, and if he could frame me as a financial drain, someone who demanded money, who required reimbursements, who was a liability, he could potentially shield those assets from the lawsuit. He could claim that the money the investors were looking for had been spent on family obligations or unexpected medical costs for a dependent. He was setting me up. He was going to walk into a courtroom and say, "I can't pay you back because I spent it all on this girl who tricked me." And the witnesses at the party? My phone buzzed. It was a text from Marianne. Marianne, I just got the guest list from the catering company your parents used, cross-referenced with LinkedIn. The man in the navy suit by the refrigerator? His name is David Thorne. He is a senior investigator for State Farm Insurance. I stared at the name. State Farm. Graham had a massive umbrella policy. If he was trying to claim some sort of loss, perhaps claiming that the baby switch was a damaging event covered by his liability insurance, he needed an adjuster there to witness the trauma. He was trying to cash out on losing me. A tap on my window made me jump. I dropped my phone, my hand flying to the door lock, but it was already engaged. I looked out, standing in the rain, wearing a heavy raincoat and the same wool beanie from the party, was the man I had seen at the law firm, Mr. Reed. He held up his hands, palms open, showing he was unarmed. He looked terrified. He pointed to the passenger seat window. I hesitated. Marianne had told me to listen to him. Do not let anyone see you doing it. We were in the darkest corner of level 4 of the parking garage. No one was here. I rolled the window down 3 inches. Mr. Reed, I said. I followed you from the law firm, he said, his voice shaking. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his hat onto his nose. I couldn't talk there. Too many cameras. Too many ears. You worked at Brightvale, I said. You were the risk manager. Retired, he corrected. Forced out. Really? 1999. He glanced over his shoulder, checking the ramp behind him. I need to tell you about that night, he said, turning back to me. Your birthday. Your father invited me. He called it a reunion. He said he wanted to make amends with the hospital staff. I thought maybe he had finally found peace. Peace? I asked. He handed me a bill. I know, Reed said, his face twisting with disgust. As soon as he started reading that spreadsheet, I knew what he was doing. He was creating a record. He was performing for the insurance guy. He is trying to prove damages. Ms. Barnes, he is trying to show that the hospital's mistake cost him his fortune so he can sue Brightvale again. Again? I asked. The word hung in the damp air. Reed froze. He looked at me, his eyes wide and red-rimmed. You don't know. Know what? There was a settlement, Reed whispered. In 1996, December. My mind raced. I was born in October. 2 months later. There was a settlement? But the Langfords didn't know, I said. They only found out last year. If the hospital settled, who did they settle with? Reed leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a rasp. That is the thing that has haunted me for 30 years. We found the error in the logs a week after you were discharged. A nurse flagged it. We did an internal audit. We knew 2 babies had been switched. We contacted the families. You contacted them? I asked. But Graham acted like he was shocked. It was an act, Reed spat. We contacted the Barnes family first. We told them there had been a potential mistake. We asked them to come in for a DNA test. They came in, but they didn't bring you. I felt the blood drain from my face. They came in with a lawyer, Reed continued. A shark from downtown. They told us that if we went public with this, if we told the other family, the rich family, the Langfords, they would sue the hospital into bankruptcy. They threatened to go to the press. They threatened to destroy the reputation of the entire medical center. So you paid them, I whispered. The board panicked, Reed said, hanging his head. Brightvale was in the middle of a merger. A scandal would have killed the deal. So they cut a check, a big one, confidentiality agreement, non-disclosure, the works. The Barnes family took the money, and in exchange, they agreed to keep the baby they had. They agreed to never tell the Langfords. I sat there, stunned. The rain pounded against the metal roof of the car, loud and relentless. My parents hadn't just discovered I wasn't theirs. They had known. They had known since I was 2 months old. They had looked at me, a tiny, helpless infant, and they had made a choice. They could have given me back to my real parents. They could have given me to the Langfords, who would have loved me, who would have raised me with horses and sailing and warmth. But they chose the money. They sold my life for a settlement check, and then, for 30 years, they resented me for the very transaction they had engineered. They treated me like a burden because every time they looked at me, they saw the crime they had committed. How much? I asked. My voice was dead. $200,000, Reed said. In 1996 money. It was enough to pay off their mortgage, enough to start Graham's investment portfolio. And the Langfords? I asked. What about them? We never told them, Reed said, his voice breaking. Part of the deal. Graham insisted on it. He didn't want the Langfords coming for you later. He wanted to keep the asset he had been paid for. So the hospital buried the file. We falsified the records to make it look like the wristband count was correct. I felt sick, physically violent. I wasn't just a victim of a mistake. I was a victim of a kidnapping that had been legalized by a contract. Why tell me now? I asked Reed. Because he is breaking the deal. Reed said, by going public at your birthday, by bringing in that insurance investigator. Graham is violating the 1996 NDA. He is desperate for money again. So he is trying to double dip. He thinks the statute of limitations is up. He thinks he can squeeze the hospital for more money by claiming new discovery. Reed reached into his raincoat pocket. He pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. I can't testify, he said. I signed the papers too. I could lose my pension. But you didn't sign anything. He shoved the paper through the crack in the window. This is the internal code for the incident report, and the name of the nurse who flagged it, the one who was on duty that night, the one who saw what really happened. Nora Klein, I read from the paper. She lives in Wisconsin now, Reed said. Eau Claire. She never took a dime. She quit the day after the settlement. If anyone knows the truth about how the switch happened, whether it was an accident or something else, it is her. Something else? I asked sharply. You said it was an error. Reed looked at me, and his expression was chilling. The wristbands were cut. Ms. Barnes, not fallen off, cut, and retaped. The world tilted. Someone wanted those babies switched, Reed whispered, and it wasn't the hospital. He pulled his collar up, turning away from the window. Find Nora, before your father realizes he has started a war he can't win. He walked away into the shadows of the parking garage, leaving me alone in the car with a wet piece of paper and a revelation that shattered the last remaining fragment of my reality. It wasn't just greed, it was a conspiracy. Graham and Elaine hadn't just taken the hush money, they might have been the ones who cut the bands. I looked at the cost log on the passenger seat. The return on investment line at the bottom took on a new, horrific meaning. I wasn't an investment they had made. I was an investment they had stolen. And they had been drawing dividends on my life since the day I was born. I started the car. I wasn't going back to the studio. I wasn't going to cry. I pulled up the map on my phone. Destination: Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I had a nurse to find. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't driving toward approval. I was driving toward revenge. The drive to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, took 90 minutes of white-knuckle driving through a driving rainstorm that seemed determined to wash my car off the interstate. I had the slip of paper from Mr. Reed tucked into the sun visor, a name, a location, and a code that felt like a grenade waiting to have its pin pulled. Nora Klein worked at a chain pharmacy nestled in a strip mall that had seen better days. The fluorescent lights inside were humming with that same headache-inducing frequency as the hospital records room. I found her in aisle 4, stocking boxes of allergy medication. She looked to be in her late 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and the tired, wary posture of someone who had spent a lifetime looking over her shoulder. I didn't introduce myself. I didn't have time for pleasantries. I walked up to her, holding my phone with the photo of the cost log visible on the screen. "Nora," I said. She dropped a box of antihistamines. It hit the linoleum floor with a sharp crack. She looked at me, her eyes widening behind her bifocals. She didn't ask who I was. She knew. I must have looked enough like the ghost of the scandal she had buried 30 years ago. "I can't talk to you," she said, her voice a harsh whisper. She bent down to pick up the box, her hands shaking visibly. "You need to leave. The manager is watching." "I don't care about the manager," I said, stepping into her personal space. "I care about Brightvale Medical Center. I care about the night of October 12th, 1996. "I don't know what you're talking about," she hissed, shoving the box onto the shelf upside down. "I left that job decades ago." "I know," I said. "You left right after the settlement, right after the wristbands were cut." Nora froze. Her back was to me, but I saw her shoulders stiffen. "I spoke to Reed," I said. The name landed like a physical blow. She turned around slowly, her face drained of color. "Reed is a fool," she said. "He thinks because he is retired, they can't touch him. They can touch anyone." "Who are they? Nora?" I asked. "My parents? Graham and Elaine Barnes?" "Your parents?" She let out a short, bitter laugh. "Honey, those two couldn't organize a bake sale without legal counsel. You think they orchestrated a cover-up like that on their own?" "Then who?" She looked toward the front of the store, checking the security cameras. "I signed a piece of paper, miss, a very expensive piece of paper. If I say a word, I lose my house. I lose my pension." "I have a code," I said. I pulled the slip of paper from my pocket. Reed gave it to me. "Internal Incident Report, 829. "Bravo?" Nora flinched. She closed her eyes for a second, as if in pain. That code was the key. It wasn't just a number. It was the proof that she had been there, that she had filed the report that started the silence. 829 Bravo, she whispered. "God help us." She opened her eyes and looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. "I can't tell you the details, but I can tell you where to look. Graham and Elaine didn't just have a lawyer. They had the lawyer." "What does that mean?" "The firm that represented the hospital in the settlement," Nora said, her voice barely audible over the store's muzak. "Sterling and Moss, they were the ones who drafted the NDAs. They were the ones who paid us off." I frowned. "So? The hospital had lawyers?" "No," Nora said, shaking her head. "You aren't listening. 2 years before you were born, Graham Barnes used Sterling and Moss to incorporate his business. He was already their client. When the hospital needed to settle with him, they didn't use opposing counsel. They used the same firm." My stomach dropped. A conflict of interest that massive was not just unethical, it was illegal. It meant the negotiation between the hospital and my parents wasn't a fight. It was a deal cooked up in a single boardroom. "Why?" I asked. "Why would they do that?" Nora looked at her watch. "My break is over. Go away. Ms. Barnes, and if you are smart, you will stop looking for your birth certificate and start looking for the adoption decree that never got filed." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the back room. I drove back to St. Paul with my mind racing. The adoption decree that never got filed. What did that mean? I called Marianne immediately. "Sterling and Moss," I said as soon as she picked up. Does that mean anything to you? There was a long pause on the other end. The sound of shuffling papers. That is a very old, very powerful firm, Marianne said. They dissolved in 2005. But Sophia, if the same firm represented both the hospital and your father in a damages settlement, the entire contract is voidable. It reeks of collusion. Nora Klein said something else, I said. She told me to look for an adoption decree. Adoption? Marianne asked sharply. But the Langford narrative is that you were switched. If you were switched, there is no adoption. You were just taken. Exactly, I said. Unless the switch wasn't a switch. Sophia, Marianne said, her tone shifting to one of urgent command. I need you to come to my office. Now, we have the results from the independent DNA test. Already? I rushed it, she said. I paid the expedited fee. You need to see this. I made it to Marianne's office in 20 minutes. The sun had set, and the city lights were reflecting off the wet pavement. I felt a sense of dread pooling in my stomach. The 0% result from the birthday party had been a knife to the heart, but at least it had been clean. It had severed the tie. It made me a victim of a random cosmic error. But Nora's words, the adoption decree that never got filed, suggested something murkier. Marianne was waiting for me in the conference room. The Langfords were not there. It was just us. On the table sat a single envelope, sealed with the logo of a lab in Chicago that had no affiliation with Graham Barnes or the Langford Trust. Sit down, Marianne said. I sat. I didn't reach for the envelope. Just tell me, am I a Langford? Marianne took a deep breath. She looked tired. She looked like a lawyer who had just realized her case was about to explode. We tested your sample against the profile we have on file for Graham Barnes, she said, and against the profile for Elaine. And? The test you saw at the birthday party, the one showing 0% connection to Graham, was falsified, Marianne said. Or, at the very least, it was manipulated. She slid the paper across the table. You are not a match for Elaine Barnes. 0%. She is not your mother. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Okay, that fit the narrative. But, Marianne continued, her finger landing on the second row of data. You are a 49.9% match for Graham Barnes. The room went silent. I stared at the number, 50%. He's my father, I whispered. My biological father. Yes, Marianne said. High probability of paternity, 99.9% confidence. I felt the room spin. Graham was my father, the man who had handed me a bill for my existence, the man who had listed my braces as a cosmetic necessity. He wasn't a stranger who had accidentally ended up with the wrong baby. He was my flesh and blood. But the switch, I stammered. The Langfords, Harper, I don't understand. If Graham is my father, then I wasn't switched with Harper. It appears, Marianne said carefully, that the switch story was a fabrication designed to cover up a different truth, a much uglier truth. I pieced it together, the horror of it dawning on me like a slow sunrise. An affair, I said. Graham had an affair. I am the result. It fits the timeline, Marianne said, and it explains the settlement with the hospital. If Graham brought an illegitimate child home, and Elaine found out, or if they arranged to have the babies swapped to hide the affair. No, I said, shaking my head. That's too complicated. Think about the money. Marianne, the cost log, the resentment. Elaine didn't hate me because I was a stranger. She hated me because I was evidence. She hated me because every time she looked at me, she saw the woman Graham cheated on her with. And Graham? Marianne asked. Graham hated me because I cost him a fortune to keep quiet, I said. And now that I'm 30, now that whatever agreement they had is mature, they decided to cut me loose, but they couldn't just say, you're a bastard. That would destroy Graham's reputation. It would destroy their marriage socially. So they invented the 0% lie. They invented the switch to make themselves look like victims. It is cleaner, Marianne agreed. Our daughter was switched at birth is a tragedy. Here is my husband's illegitimate child, whom we pretended was ours for 30 years, is a scandal. My phone buzzed on the mahogany table. It vibrated loudly, startling both of us. I looked at the screen. Sender. Elaine. I picked it up. The message was 3 words long. Stop digging. Now. No explanations. No, how are you? Just a threat. She knew. She knew I was getting close to the truth about the settlement, about the law firm, about the lie that was the foundation of my life. She knows, I told Marianne, showing her the phone. Marianne's face hardened. If you are Graham's daughter, Sophia, your legal standing changes completely. You are not a stranger they can evict. You are a legal heir. You have rights to the home. You have rights to support. I don't want their money, I spat. I want to burn them down. There is a complication, Marianne said. She pulled another document from her briefcase. This one was on thick, cream-colored paper. The Langfords. What about them? They don't know, Marianne said. They still believe the hospital error theory. They still believe you are their biological daughter. Harper's replacement. They believe the 0% result from the party was accurate regarding Graham. But I'm not, I said. If I'm Graham's daughter, I'm not a Langford, unless, I stopped, unless Graham had an affair with Mrs. Langford. But looking at Celeste, the fragile, broken woman who smelled of lavender, that seemed impossible. You aren't a Langford, Marianne confirmed, which means you are not the beneficiary of the trust. She slid the cream-colored document toward me. This arrived via courier an hour ago. It is a declaration of identity. The Langfords want you to sign it, immediately. They are pressuring us to expedite the process so the trust can be unlocked before the fiscal quarter ends. I looked at the document. It was a lie. If I signed it, I would be declaring under penalty of perjury that I believed myself to be the biological child of Elias and Celeste Langford. If I sign this, I said, I am committing fraud. Yes, Marianne said. And if you don't sign it, you lose the protection of the Langford family. You lose the resources we are using to fight Graham. You go back to being Sophia Barnes, the girl with no money, no home, and a father who is suing her for retroactive damages. I stood up and walked to the window. Below me, the city of Minneapolis looked like a circuit board, cold and logical. I was trapped. On one side, I had the Barnes family, my biological father and his wife, who had erased me, monetized me, and were now threatening me to keep their 30-year-old secrets buried. They wanted to destroy me to save their reputation and their bank account. On the other side, I had the Langfords, a grieving, wealthy family who wanted to save me, but only because they thought I was someone else. They wanted to paste a label on me, call me Harper, and use me to unlock their millions. If I told the Langfords the truth, that I was Graham's bastard, they would drop me. I would be nothing to them, just another reminder of the daughter they lost. They want me to sign? I asked, turning back to Marianne. They are insisting on it, Marianne said. Celeste is frantic. She keeps saying she wants to secure your future. She wants to secure the trust, I corrected. I looked at Elaine's text again. Stop digging. Marianne, I said, if Graham is my father, does that mean the debt is real? Can he actually sue me for the investment? If he is your father, the parental obligation laws kick in, Marianne said. He can't sue a child for the cost of raising them. That is the law, but he has that loan. The one you signed. He has the paper trail creating a narrative of an ungrateful, expensive adult dependent. He framed me, I said. He set this up perfectly. Almost perfectly, Marianne said. He didn't count on you finding Nora, and he didn't count on the second DNA test. I picked up the pen lying on the table. I looked at the Langford document. I can't sign this, I said. I won't trade one lie for another. I spent 30 years living a lie in that house on Birchwood Lane. I am not going to start my 30s by becoming a professional imposter for the Langfords. Then we are on our own, Marianne said. And the Langfords will not be happy when they find out. Let them be unhappy, I said. I am done pleasing people. I put the pen down. Marianne, send the new DNA results to Graham. Don't send a letter. Don't send a threat. Just send the page that says, probability of paternity, 99%. Marianne smiled. A slow, dangerous smile. He will panic. Good, I said. When he panics, he makes mistakes. He invited 73 people to watch him disown me. Let's see who he invites when he realizes he can't get rid of me. I grabbed my coat. Where are you going? Marianne asked. I'm going to find out who my mother is, I said. If it's not Elaine, and it's not Celeste Langford, then there is a third woman, a woman Graham erased even more effectively than he erased me. I walked to the door, pausing with my hand on the frame. And Marianne, tell the Langfords I'm busy. Tell them I'm checking the math. I walked out into the night. The pressure in my chest was building, a tight, hot sensation that felt like an explosion waiting to happen. Graham thought he had closed the ledger. He thought he had zeroed out the account. But he forgot one thing about accounting. You can cook the books all you want, but eventually, the audit always comes. And I was the auditor from hell. The conference room at Marianne Holt's firm was designed to intimidate. It was a glass box suspended 20 stories above the gray streets of Minneapolis, with a table made of polished walnut that stretched out like a landing strip. We were not here for a family therapy session. We were here for a demolition. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in the sharpest suit I owned, a navy blue tailored blazer and trousers that I had bought with my own money. Not Graham's. I sat on the left side of the table, flanked by Marianne and my forensic accountant friend, Kevin, whom I had asked to join as a consultant. On the credenza behind me, a coffee machine gurgled, the only sound in the tense, pressurized silence. Remember, Marianne whispered. Arranging a stack of files in a perfect grid in front of her, they expect you to be emotional. They expect the daughter who was crying in the driveway. Do not give them that person. Give them the auditor. I nodded, my hands resting flat on the cold wood. I am ready. At 10 o'clock sharp, the double doors swung open. Graham walked in first. He looked thinner than he had a week ago, his face drawn and gray, but he still wore the arrogance of a man who believed he could negotiate his way out of a plane crash. He was followed by a nervous-looking man in a cheap suit, his personal attorney, I assumed, and then Elaine. Elaine was the one who chilled me. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at the room. She walked with a stiff, mechanical gait, clutching her purse as if it contained the last vestige of her dignity. She sat down at the far end of the table, placing her phone face down. Behind them came the reluctant guests. Nora Klein shuffled in, looking like she was walking to the gallows. She refused to make eye contact with anyone, sinking into a chair near the door. And finally, Mr. Reed entered. He wasn't wearing his beanie or his raincoat today. He was wearing a vintage brown suit, pressed and clean. He didn't stand by the wall. He walked straight to the table and sat next to me, placing a thick, leather-bound binder in front of him. Let us begin, Marianne said, her voice cutting through the air like a gavel. Wait, Graham interrupted, holding up a hand. His palm was damp. Before we say a word, I want it stipulated. No press, no recordings. This is a private settlement discussion. If I see a single reporter, I walk. I looked at him, really looked at him, for 30 years. I thought his obsession with privacy was just a quirk of his personality. Now I realized it was a survival strategy. He wasn't afraid of embarrassment. He was afraid of evidence. There is no press. Mr. Barnes, Marianne said calmly. Just the interested parties. Good, Graham said, adjusting his tie. Then let's get this over with. My client, my wife and I, are prepared to offer Sophia a severance package. We are willing to forgive the debts she incurred, including the loan for the home renovation, in exchange for a complete release of claims and a non-disclosure agreement regarding the genetic anomaly. I almost laughed. A severance package. He was firing me. There will be no severance package, I said. My voice was steady. dropping into the lower register I used during board presentations. And there will be no release of claims, because we aren't here to discuss what you think I owe you. We are here to discuss what you stole, Graham sneered. I kept the receipts. Sophia, $600,000. You want to go to court? I will bankrupt you. Let's talk about those receipts, I said. I reached into my bag and pulled out the copy of the cost log he had so proudly displayed at my birthday. I slid it across the table. It spun on the polished wood and stopped right in front of him. Page 14, I cited from memory. December 2003. $5,000 for pediatric asthma therapy. I never had asthma. Graham. It was a preventative treatment, Graham blustered, though his eyes darted to his lawyer. You had a cough. No, Kevin spoke up, opening his laptop. It was a flexible spending account claim. We pulled the records from your former employer's benefits administrator. You submitted a receipt for a nebulizer and steroid treatments. The reimbursement check was issued to you. You cashed it, and then you listed that amount as a cost of raising Sophia. That is double dipping. Mr. Barnes, actually, it is insurance fraud. Graham's face went rigid. Page 22, I continued, relentless. April 2010, a $10,000 educational support fee. That was the year you renovated the deck. You claimed me as a dependent with special needs on your tax return that year to increase your deduction limit. Kevin calculated the tax benefit you received over 30 years by claiming a child you knew wasn't yours. It amounts to over $80,000 in federal tax avoidance. I leaned forward. You didn't keep this log to teach me a lesson about gratitude. You kept it to keep your own lies straight. This isn't a ledger of love. Graham, it's a confession of embezzlement. Graham slammed his hand on the table. This is ridiculous. I took you in. I fed you. You were paid to take her in. Mr. Reed's voice boomed across the table. Graham froze. He looked at the old man, squinting. Who the hell are you? I am the man who processed the check, Reed said. He opened his leather binder. The sound of the metal rings snapping open echoed in the room. He pulled out a yellowed, faded document and held it up. It had the Brightvale Medical Center letterhead on it. December 4th, 1996. Reed read, Settlement agreement between Brightvale Medical Center and Graham and Elaine Barnes. Payment amount, $250,000. Term, perpetual silence regarding the patient identification error in the maternity ward. Reed tossed the document onto the table. It landed on top of the cost log. You weren't a charitable father, Reed said, his voice shaking with 30 years of suppressed anger. You were a blackmailer. You found out about the switch, and instead of giving the baby back to her real mother, you leveraged her. You sold her right to her own identity for $250,000. The room was suffocatingly quiet. Graham's lawyer was reading the document, his face paling. He whispered something to Graham, but Graham shoved him away. We protected her, Graham shouted, the veins in his neck bulging. We saved the family from a scandal. We raised her as our own. You raised me as an employee, I said cold. And when the contract expired, you tried to cash me out. You have no proof of intent, Graham spat. We thought it was for the best. We didn't know the other family. We didn't know who they were. Actually, Marianne interrupted. You did? She pressed a button on a remote control. A screen descended from the ceiling. A projection flickered to life. It was a digital log, a complex string of code and timestamps. What is this? Graham asked, his voice trembling. This is the access log from the private DNA lab you used for the birthday test, Marianne said. You claimed the result was 0% relatedness. You claimed you were shocked. She pointed to a highlighted line of code. This log shows that the user account G. Barnes accessed the portal 3 days before the party. You downloaded the raw data. The raw data showed a 99.9% paternity match. You are Sophia's biological father, Graham. Graham sank back into his chair. He looked small. He looked defeated. But you didn't just hide that. Marianne continued. You edited the PDF. You manually changed the result to 0. And we know this because the compliance officer for the lab was standing in your kitchen. Graham looked up, bewildered. What? The man in the gray suit, I said. The one standing by the window. You thought he was a cousin? Or a neighbor? He was an auditor from the lab. Marianne sent him. We knew you were going to try something. Graham, we just needed you to do it in front of a witness. He saw the unaltered report on your laptop screen when you opened the file, Marianne said. He testified in a deposition this morning. You forged a medical document to disown your own biological child in front of 70 witnesses. That is not just cruel. It is fraud. It is emotional distress, and it destroys your credibility in any court in this country. Graham looked at Elaine. Elaine, tell them we did it to keep the family together. Elaine didn't move. She stared at the table, her face a mask of stone. So, I said, standing up, here is the new deal. You are going to sign over the house on Birchwood Lane. You are going to repay the $15,000 loan you took out in my name, and you are going to admit, on the record, that you are my father. Graham looked trapped. He looked at the documents, the tax fraud, the insurance fraud, the forged DNA test, the settlement agreement. He was surrounded. Fine, he whispered. Fine, I am your father. I made a mistake before I met Elaine. I didn't know about you until the hospital called. When we found out, we panicked. He looked at me, pleading. But the switch that was the hospital, that was an accident. We just took advantage of it. We didn't cause it. I looked at Nora Klein. She had been silent this whole time, wringing her hands in her lap. Is that true? Nora? I asked. Nora looked up. Her eyes were wet. She looked at Graham, and then she looked at Elaine. No, Nora whispered. Speak up, Marianne commanded. No, Nora cried out. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't the hospital. She stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. I was the night nurse, Nora sobbed. I was on the floor. It was 2 a.m. The nursery was quiet. Someone came in. They were wearing a coat over their hospital gown. They had a mask on. But I saw who it was. Graham looked confused. What are you talking about? Nora ignored him. She looked straight at me. She gave me an envelope, Nora said, her voice shaking. It had $5,000 in cash, and a note. The note said, swap the bands. No one will know. They look enough alike. Who? I asked. Who gave you the money? Nora? Nora lifted a trembling finger. She didn't point at Graham. She pointed to the end of the table. She did. All heads turned to Elaine. My mother, the woman who had folded my clothes, who had policed my manners, who had looked at me with cold indifference for 30 years, sat perfectly still. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. Elaine, Graham whispered, his voice full of genuine horror. You were in the recovery room. You couldn't walk. I could walk, Elaine said. Her voice was clear, calm, and utterly terrifying. She finally looked up. She looked at Graham, and the contempt in her eyes was withering. I knew, Elaine said. I knew about your affair. Graham, I knew about the tramp you slept with. And when the hospital called me when they told me there was another baby born that night, I knew it was hers. She turned her gaze to me. It was like looking into a black hole. I wasn't going to raise a bastard, Elaine said, and I wasn't going to let you leave me for her. So I made a choice. I swapped them. I gave the Langfords your bastard, Graham, and I took their daughter. I took the legitimate child. I took the one who deserved a family. Wait, my mind reeled. I looked at Marianne. Marianne looked stunned. But, I stammered, the DNA. Marianne said I am Graham's daughter. That means I am the illegitimate child. Elaine smiled, a thin, cruel smile. Exactly, she said. I failed. She laughed, a dry, humorless sound. I tried to swap you, she said to me. I paid that nurse to put the Langford bracelet on you and the Barnes bracelet on the other baby. I wanted to send you away. I wanted to keep the Langford baby. Harper. I wanted to raise her. But this idiot, she pointed at Nora. She messed it up. Nora was sobbing now. I was scared. My hands were shaking. I thought I did it right. You didn't, Elaine hissed. You switched them back, or you got confused. I don't know. But when we got home, when the settlement happened, I realized. I looked at you. Sophia. You had his nose. You had his chin. I knew immediately. I had planned the perfect crime. And instead, I ended up stuck with exactly what I was trying to get rid of. The room was spinning. Elaine hadn't just been complicit. She had been the architect. She had tried to steal Harper, the rich, legitimate baby, and dump me, the product of her husband's infidelity, on the Langfords. But in her panic, or Nora's incompetence, the switch had failed. Or perhaps it had been corrected by accident. So she was stuck with me. She was stuck with the proof of her husband's betrayal. And instead of loving me, instead of admitting defeat, she punished me. For 30 years. That's why you hate me, I whispered. Not because I cost money, but because I'm the mistake you couldn't get rid of. You are a reminder, Elaine said, standing up and smoothing her skirt. Every day, I had to look at you. Every day, I had to feed you. And Graham, he was too stupid to realize. He thought we were just handling a situation. He didn't know I tried to fix it. Graham looked like he was going to be sick. You tried to give away my daughter? I tried to give away your sin, Elaine screamed, losing her composure for the first time. And I would do it again. She looked around the room, at the lawyers, the witnesses, the stunned faces. So go ahead, Elaine said, grabbing her purse. Sue me. Put me in jail. I don't care. At least in prison. I won't have to look at her face anymore. She turned to leave. But the door opened before she could reach it. 2 police officers stood in the hallway. Behind them was Marianne's assistant. We heard enough, one of the officers said. Mrs. Barnes, we have a warrant for your arrest, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and fraud. Elaine didn't fight. She didn't cry. She just held out her wrists, her face returning to that mask of cold, bored indifference. As they led her away, she paused and looked back at Graham. You should have checked the wristbands, Graham, she said. You always were terrible at the details. I sat in the chair, the cost log forgotten on the table. The silence in the room was heavy. Final. Graham put his head in his hands and began to weep. It wasn't the crying of a victim. It was the crying of a man who realized that for 30 years, he had been sleeping next to a monster, and he had been too cheap to turn on the lights. I looked at Marianne. She gave me a small, sad nod. The reckoning was over, but the ledger was far from balanced. The settlement conference was held in a room that smelled of lemon polish and impending doom. It was designed to look like a standard corporate mediation. Long mahogany table, pitchers of ice water, paralegals typing furiously in the corners, but the tension in the air was so thick you could taste the iron. Everyone was polite. Everyone was wearing their best suits. But the words being exchanged across the table were not negotiations. They were knives. Graham sat across from me, looking less like a father and more like a cornered CEO trying to salvage a bad quarterly report. He had his lawyer next to him, a man who looked like he regretted taking the retainer fee. And then there was Elaine. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped on the table, staring at a spot on the wall as if she were watching a movie only she could see. Graham cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out the cost log. He placed it on the table with a reverence that made my stomach turn. I just want what is fair, Graham said, his voice trembling with a self-righteousness that was almost impressive. I am not the villain here. I am a victim of circumstance. Look at these figures. Look at the sacrifice. We spent 30 years raising a child we thought was ours. Or at least, a child we agreed to take on. This log proves that I went above and beyond. I sacrificed my retirement. I sacrificed my lifestyle. He pushed the binder toward the center of the table. I am willing to settle, Graham continued, looking at the mediator, if Sophia agrees to sign a statement absolving us of emotional distress. And if the Langford Trust agrees to reimburse the expenses listed here, $642,000, we will walk away. It is a fair price for 30 years of room and board. I didn't get angry. I didn't yell. I looked at Marianne, and I saw the shark-like grin spread across her face. We had prepared for this. I wasn't going to fight him with tears. I was going to fight him with paper. That is an interesting offer, Graham, Marianne said smoothly. But before we discuss reimbursement, we need to discuss the validity of your evidence. She opened her laptop and connected it to the room's projector. A spreadsheet appeared on the screen. It wasn't the cost log. It was a digital access report. This, Marianne said, pointing a laser pointer at a timestamp, is the back-end log from the private DNA laboratory you used for Sophia's birthday reveal. You claimed the result was 0%. You claimed you were shocked to find out she wasn't yours. Marianne clicked a button. The screen zoomed in. This log shows that the account registered to Graham Barnes accessed the raw data file 3 days before the party. The raw data clearly showed a 99.9% probability of paternity. You are her father, Graham. You knew it. And at 8:45 p.m. on the night before the party, a user with administrative override privileges manually edited the PDF to display 0%. Graham's face drained of color. That is a glitch. A computer error. Is it? Marianne asked. Because the IP address that authorized the edit doesn't match your computer. Graham, it matches the desktop computer in the master bedroom study, the one Elaine uses. All eyes turned to Elaine. She didn't blink. And, Marianne continued, twisting the knife, we have a witness. A man stood up from the row of chairs against the back wall. It was the man in the gray suit from the party. The one I had thought was a boring cousin. He walked to the table and placed a badge on the wood. My name is David Thorne, he said, his voice flat and professional. I am the senior compliance officer for Gentech Labs. I was present at the party because Mrs. Barnes called our customer service line, demanded an observer to verify the results. She thought it would add legitimacy. What she didn't know is that I record all system access during verified events. He looked at Graham. I watched the file being altered in real time. Mr. Barnes, and I have the sworn affidavit here. Graham looked at Elaine, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Elaine, you changed the result? It needed to be 0, Elaine said. Her voice was quiet, conversational, as if she were discussing the weather. 0 is a clean number, 50% is messy. But wait, Mr. Reed spoke up from my side of the table. He slid a yellow document across the mahogany surface. The mess started a long time before the DNA test. Reed looked at the opposing lawyer. This is the original settlement agreement from Brightvale Medical Center, dated December 1996. It outlines the payment of $250,000 to the Barnes family in exchange for silence regarding the baby switch. Reed tapped the signature line at the bottom. Graham signed it, Reed said. But look at the witness signature. Look who signed as the legal guardian and knowing participant. I leaned in. The signature was elegant, looped, and sharp. Elaine Barnes. You knew, I whispered, looking at my mother. You didn't just find out. You signed the deal. Elaine finally turned her head. She looked at me, and for the first time, the mask of the boring suburban housewife cracked, revealing something sharp and jagged underneath. Of course I knew, she said. I orchestrated it. The room went dead silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop humming. What? Graham whispered. Oh, stop it. Graham, Elaine snapped, rolling her eyes. Stop playing the innocent martyr. You were a mess in '96. You had that affair with that woman, that waitress from the diner in Duluth. You thought I didn't know? You thought you were so clever? She turned to the mediator, her voice gaining strength. He got her pregnant, Elaine said, pointing a manicured finger at Graham. He came home crying, begging for forgiveness. He said the woman died in childbirth. He said he was stuck with the baby. He brought her home. He brought you home. Sophia. I felt the air leave my lungs. My mother, my biological mother, died in childbirth, and Graham had brought me home? I told him I would stay, Elaine continued, her voice cold as ice. I told him I would raise his bastard, but I had conditions. I said the past had to be cut, clean, no reminders. She looked at me with a hatred that was 30 years old. But then the hospital called. They said there was a mix-up in the nursery. They said there was another baby involved, a baby belonging to a rich family. The Langfords. Elaine smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. I saw an opportunity. I told the nurse, Nora, to make the switch permanent. I wanted to give you away. Sophia, I wanted to swap Graham's mistake for a clean slate. I wanted to take the Langford baby, raise her as our own, and let you disappear into their world where we would never have to see you again. You tried to trade me? I choked out. I tried to fix our family, Elaine shouted, slamming her hand on the table. But it failed. Maybe Nora lost her nerve. Maybe the bands got mixed up again. But we came home with you. I knew it immediately. You have her eyes. You have that woman's eyes. She looked at Graham, who was staring at her with horror. I did it to protect us, Graham. I did it so we wouldn't have to look at your sin every day. But when the switch failed, I made sure we got paid for it. I made sure the hospital paid us for the trauma. And I made sure you. She looked at me. Knew exactly what you were, a debt, a cost, a burden. That is why you kept the log. I realized. Not for money, but to punish him. Every dollar you wrote down was a way of reminding Graham of what his affair cost you. Precise, Elaine said. Every cent. I wanted him to feel it. And the 0% result? Marianne asked softly. Because I was done, Elaine said, gathering her purse. 30 years. That was the deal I made with myself. I raised her. I did my time. I wanted you out of my house. I wanted to erase the last trace of that woman. 0% meant you were gone. It meant I finally won. The silence that followed was heavy. Absolute. Then, the laboratory compliance officer stood up. Mrs. Barnes, he said, I am submitting my report to the district attorney. Tampering with medical records to facilitate fraud is a federal offense. Mr. Reed stood up next. And Brightvale Medical Center is reopening the investigation into the 1996 incident. Now that we know the switch was an intentional act of kidnapping and conspiracy, the statute of limitations is complicated. Graham looked at his wife. You ruined us, he whispered. You didn't protect the family. You destroyed it. I kept it together for 30 years, Elaine screamed. I did the laundry. I cooked the meals. I tolerated her. I stood up. I didn't feel weak anymore. I didn't feel like the girl who cried in the driveway. You didn't tolerate me, Elaine, I said. You used me. You used me to torture him, and you used me to balance your own emotional books. I walked over to where she sat. I have one question, I said. Elaine looked up at me, her eyes defiant. Did you kick me out that night because of the DNA? I asked. Or did you kick me out because you were terrified that if I stayed one day past 30, I would figure out that you had built my entire life on a foundation of lies? Elaine didn't answer. She didn't have to. The fear in her eyes said everything. The doors opened. The police were not waiting in the hall this time. They were walking in. Marianne had signaled them. Elaine Barnes, the officer said, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, fraud, and extortion. As they handcuffed her, Graham sat with his head in his hands. Weeping, he was facing tax evasion charges, insurance fraud charges, and the total collapse of his reputation. The cost log sat on the table between them, the evidence of their own demise. The resolution fell like dominoes. Graham was indicted on 3 counts of tax fraud and 1 count of identity theft for the loan he took out in my name. His assets were frozen. The house on Birchwood Lane, the house I was kicked out of, was seized to pay his legal fees and the restitution he owed the IRS, Brightvale Medical Center, desperate to avoid a public PR nightmare, settled with me privately. They issued a formal apology and a transparency report that cleared my name. Nora Klein, for her cooperation and testimony, was granted immunity, though she lost her license. She moved to Florida, finally free of the secret she had carried for 3 decades. And then there were the Langfords. I met them a week later at a quiet cafe by the river, not at a law firm, not at their estate, just neutral ground. Celeste looked tired, but she smiled when she saw me. It was a genuine smile this time, not the frantic, searching look of a woman trying to replace a ghost. "We know you aren't Harper," Elias said gently as we sat down. Marianne explained everything. "You are Graham's daughter." "I am," I said. "And I am sorry. I know you wanted me to be her." "We wanted a daughter," Celeste corrected. She reached across the table and took my hand. "And we know what you have been through. We know you are alone." "I'm managing," I said. "We have a lot of room," Elias said. "The house it is too big for 2 people. You don't have to be Harper. You don't have to ride horses. You don't have to sail." He paused. "We would just like to get to know Sophia." I looked at them. They were kind. They were offering me a soft place to land. It was tempting. God, it was tempting to just fall into their wealth and their warmth and let them take care of me. But I wasn't a child anymore, and I wasn't a project. "I can't move in," I said softly. "I need to live in my own apartment. I need to pay my own bills. I need to know that the roof over my head belongs to me." Celeste looked disappointed, but she nodded. "But," I added, "I am free for dinner on Sunday." Celeste's face lit up. "Sunday is good. I can make well. What do you like?" I smiled. It was the first time in my life a parental figure had asked me that question without looking at a price tag. "I like Italian," I said, "and I hate pot roast." "Italian it is," Elias said, grinning. That night, I went back to my studio apartment in St. Paul. It was still mostly empty, just the gray towels and the boxes I hadn't unpacked, but it felt different. It didn't feel like a holding cell anymore. It felt like a fortress. I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up the bottle of expensive Cabernet, the same bottle I had brought to the birthday party, the bottle I had clutched like a lifeline while Graham read his spreadsheet. I opened it. The cork made a satisfying pop. I poured a glass and walked to the window. Looking out at the city lights, I took a sip. It was rich, complex, and tasted like victory. I looked at the empty spot on the wall where I had taped the cost log. I had shredded it this morning. I wasn't an investment. I wasn't a liability. I wasn't a 0% error. I was Sophia Barnes. I was the daughter of a woman I never knew, and a father who couldn't afford me. But tonight, standing in the quiet of my own home, paid for with my own money, I realized something. Family isn't a ledger you balance. It isn't a contract you sign. And for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't anyone's invoice. I was finally, completely, paid in full. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I really hope you enjoyed Sophia's journey from betrayal to justice. I'd love to know where you are tuning in from. Please drop a comment below with your country or city. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this revenge drama, please consider subscribing to the channel Kate Revenge Stories, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this video get recommended to more people. Your support means the world to me. See you in the next story.